Beautiful Stories from Shakespeare by E. Nesbit. It may be said of Shakespeare that from his works may be collected a system of civil and economical prudence. He has been imitated by all succeeding writers, and it may be doubted whether from all his successors more maxims of theoretical knowledge or more rules of practical prudence can be collected than he alone has given to his country. Dr. Samuel Johnson, Preface. The writings of Shakespeare have been justly termed the richest, the purest, the fairest, that genius uninspired ever penned. Shakespeare instructed by delighting, his plays alone, leaving mere science out of the question, contain more actual wisdom than the whole body of English learning. He is the teacher of all good pity, generosity, true courage, love. His bright wit is cut out into little stars. His solid masses of knowledge are meted out in morsels and proverbs, and thus distributed, there is scarcely a corner of the English-speaking world today which he does not illuminate, or a cottage which he does not enrich. His bounty is like the sea, which, though often unacknowledged, is everywhere felt. As his friend Ben Jonson wrote of him, he was not of an age, but for all time. He ever kept the high road of human life, whereon all travel. He did not pick out by paths of feeling and sentiment. In his creations we have no moral highwaymen, sentimental thieves, interesting villains, and amiable, elegant adventuresses, no delicate entanglements of situation, in which the grossest images are presented to the mind disguised under the superficial attraction of style and sentiment. He flattered no bad passion, disguised no vice in the garb of virtue, trifled with no just and generous principle. While causing us to laugh at folly and shudder at crime, he still preserves our love for our fellow beings and our reverence for ourselves. Shakespeare was familiar with all beautiful forms and images, with all that is sweet or majestic in the simple aspects of nature, of that indestructible love of flowers and fragrance, and dews and clear waters and soft airs and sounds, and bright skies and woodland solitudes and moonlight, bowers, which are the material elements of poetry, and with that fine sense of their indefinable relation to mental emotion, which is its essence and vivifying soul, and which, in the midst of his most busy and tragical scenes, falls like gleams of sunshine on rocks and ruins contrasting with all that is rugged or repulsive, and reminding us of the existence of purer and brighter elements. These things considered, what wonder is it that the works of Shakespeare next to the Bible are the most highly esteemed of all the classics of English literature. So extensively have the characters of Shakespeare been drawn upon by artists, poets, and writers of fiction. Says an American author, so interwoven are these characters in the great body of English literature, that to be ignorant of the plot of these dramas is often a cause of embarrassment. But Shakespeare wrote for grown-up people, for men and women, and in words that little folks cannot understand. Hence, this volume. To reproduce the entertaining stories contained in the plays of Shakespeare, in a form so simple that children can understand and enjoy them, was the object had in view by the author of these beautiful stories from Shakespeare, and that the youngest readers may not stumble in pronouncing any unfamiliar names to be met with in the stories. The editor has prepared and included in the volume a pronouncing vocabulary of difficult names, to which is added a collection of Shakespearean quotations, classified in alphabetical order, illustrative of the wisdom and genius of the world's greatest dramatist, A.T.R. A Brief Life of Shakespeare. In the Register of Baptisms of the Parish Church of Stratford-upon-Avon, a market town in Warwickshire, England, appears, under date of April 26, 1564, the entry of the baptism of William, the son of John Shakespeare. The entry is in Latin Gulielmus Filius Johannes Shakespeare. The date of William Shakespeare's birth has usually been taken as 3 days before his baptism, but there is certainly no evidence of this fact. The family name was variously spelled, the dramatist himself not always spelling it in the same way, while in the baptismal record the name is spelled Shakespeare. In several authentic autographs of the dramatist it reads Shakespeare, and in the first edition of his works it is printed Shakespeare. Halliwell tells us that there are not less than 34 ways in which the various members of the Shakespeare family wrote the name, and in the Council Book of the Corporation of Stratford, where it is introduced 166 times during the period that the dramatist's father was a member of the municipal body, there are 14 different spellings. The modern Shakespeare is not among them. Shakespeare's father, while an alderman at Stratford, appears to have been unable to write his name, but as at that time 9 men out of 10 were content to make their mark for a signature, the fact is not specially to his discredit. The traditions and other sources of information about the occupation of Shakespeare's father differ. He is described as a butcher, a woolstapler, and a glover, and it is not impossible that he may have been all of these simultaneously or at different times, or that if he could not properly be called any one of them, the nature of his occupation was such as to make it easy to understand how the various traditions sprang up. He was a landed proprietor and cultivator of his own land even before his marriage, and he received with his wife, who was Mary Arden, daughter of a country gentleman, the estate of Asbyes, 56 acres in extent. William was the 3rd child. The 2 older than he were daughters, and both probably died in infancy. After him was born 3 sons and a daughter. For 10 or 12 years at least, after Shakespeare's birth, his father continued to be in easy circumstances. In the year 1568, he was the High Bailiff or Chief Magistrate of Stratford, and for many years afterwards he held the position of alderman, as he had done for 3 years before. To the completion of his 10th year, therefore, it is natural to suppose that William Shakespeare would get the best education that Stratford could afford. The free school of the town was open to all boys, and like all the grammar schools of that time, was under the direction of men who, as graduates of the universities, were qualified to diffuse that sound scholarship which was once the boast of England. There is no record of Shakespeare's having been at this school, but there can be no rational doubt that he was educated there. His father could not have procured for him a better education anywhere. To those who have studied Shakespeare's works without being influenced by the old traditional theory that he had received a very narrow education, they abound with evidences that he must have been solidly grounded in the learning, properly so called, was taught in the grammar schools. There are local associations connected with Stratford which could not be without their influence in the formation of young Shakespeare's mind. Within the range of such a boy's curiosity were the fine old historic towns of Warwick and Coventry, the sumptuous palace of Kenilworth, the grand monastic remains of Evesham. His own Avon abounded with spots of singular beauty, quiet hamlets, solitary woods. Nor was Stratford shut out from the general world, as many country towns are. It was a great highway, and dealers with every variety of merchandise resorted to its markets. The eyes of the poet-dramatist must always have been open for observation. But nothing is known positively of Shakespeare from his birth to his marriage to Anne Hathaway in 1582, and from that date nothing but the birth of 3 children until we find him an actor in London about 1589. How long acting continued to be Shakespeare's sole profession, we have no means of knowing, but it is in the highest degree probable that very soon after arriving in London he began that work of adaptation by which he is known to have begun his literary career. To improve and alter older plays, not up to the standard that was required at the time, was a common practice even among the best dramatists of the day, and Shakespeare's abilities would speedily mark him out as eminently fitted for this kind of work. When the alterations in plays originally composed by other writers became very extensive, the work of adaptation would become in reality a work of creation. And this is exactly what we have examples of in a few of Shakespeare's early works, which are known to have been founded on older plays. It is unnecessary here to extol the published works of the world's greatest dramatist. Criticism has been exhausted upon them, and the finest minds of England, Germany, and America have devoted their powers to an elucidation of their worth. Shakespeare died at Stratford on the 23rd of April, 1616. His father had died before him in 1602, and his mother in 1608. His wife survived him till August 1623. His wife survived him till August 1623. His so Hamlet died in 1596 at the age of 11 years. His two daughters survived him, the eldest of whom, Susanna, had, in 1607, married a physician of Stratford, Dr. Hall. The only issue of this marriage, a daughter named Elizabeth, born in 1608, married first Thomas Nesbit and afterwards Sir John Barnard, but left no children by either marriage. Shakespeare's younger daughter Judith, on the 10th of February 1616, married a Stratford gentleman named Thomas Quincy, by whom she had 3 sons, all of whom died, however, without issue. There are thus no direct descendants of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's fellow actors, fellow dramatists, and those who knew him in other ways, agree in expressing not only admiration of his genius, but their respect and love for the man. Ben Jonson said, "I love the man, and do honour his memory, on this side idolatry, as much as any." He was indeed honest, and of an open and free nature. He was buried on the 2nd day after his death, on the north side of the chancel of Stratford Church. Over his grave there is a flat stone with this inscription said to have been written by himself. "Good friend, for Jesus' sake forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be ye man, it spares these stones, and cursed be ye man, it spares these stones, and cursed be he, yet moves my bones." A Midsummer Night's Dream, Hermia and Lysander were lovers, but Hermia's father wished her to marry another man named Demetrius. Now in Athens, where they lived, there was a wicked law by which any girl who refused to marry according to her father's wishes might be put to death. Hermia's father was so angry with her for refusing to do as he wished that he actually brought her before the Duke of Athens to ask that she might be killed if she still refused to obey him. The Duke gave her 4 days to think about it, and, at the end of that time, if she still refused to marry Demetrius, she would have to die. Lysander, of course, was nearly mad with grief, and the best thing to do seemed to him for Hermia to run away to his aunt's house, at a place beyond the reach of that cruel law. And there he would come to her and marry her. But before she started, she told her friend Helena what she was going to do. Helena had been Demetrius's sweetheart long before his marriage with Hermia had been thought of, and being very silly, like all jealous people, she could not see that it was not poor Hermia's fault that Demetrius wished to marry her instead of his own lady, Helena. She knew that if she told Demetrius that Hermia was going, as she was, to the wood outside Athens, he would follow her, and I can follow him, and at least I shall see him, she said to herself. So she went to him and betrayed her friend's secret. Now this wood, where Lysander was to meet Hermia, and where the other two had decided to follow them, was full of fairies, as most woods are, if one only had the eyes to see them, and in this wood on this night were the king and queen of the fairies, Oberon and Titania. Now fairies are very wise people, but now and then they can be quite as foolish as mortal folk. Oberon and Titania, who might have been as happy as the days were long, had thrown away all their joy in a foolish quarrel. They never met without saying disagreeable things to each other, and scolded each other so dreadfully that all their little fairy followers, for fear, would creep into acorn cups and hide them there. So, instead of keeping one happy court and dancing all night through in the moonlight as is fairies' use, The king with his attendants wandered through one part of the wood, while the queen with hers kept state in another. And the cause of all this trouble was a little Indian boy whom Titania had taken to be one of her followers. Oberon wanted the child to follow him and be one of his fairy knights, but the queen would not give him up. On this night, in a mossy moonlit glade, the king and queen of the fairies met. "Ill met by moonlight, proud Titania," said the king.
"What? Jealous Oberon," answered the queen.
"You spoil everything with your quarrelling. Come, fairies, let us leave him. I'm not friends with him now." "It rests with you to make up the quarrel," said the king. "Give me that little Indian boy, and I will again be your humble servant and suitor." "Set your mind at rest," said the queen. "Your whole fairy kingdom buys not that boy from me. Come, fairies." And she and her train rode off down the moonbeams. "Well, go your ways," said Oberon, "but I'll be even with you before you leave this wood." Then Oberon called his favourite fairy Puck. Puck was the spirit of mischief. He used to slip into the dairies and take the cream away, and get into the churn so that the butter would not come, and turn the beer sour, and lead people out of their way on dark nights, and then laugh at them, and tumble people's stools from under them when they were going to sit down and upset their hot ale over their chins when they were going to drink. "Now," said Oberon to this little sprite, "fetch me the flower called Love in Idleness. The juice of that little purple flower laid on the eyes of those who sleep will make them, when they wake, to love the first thing they see. I will put some of the juice of that flower on my Titania's eyes, and when she wakes, she will love the first thing she sees, were it lion, bear, or wolf, or bull, or meddling monkey, or a busy ape." While Puck was gone, Demetrius passed through the glade, followed by poor Helena, and still she told him how she loved him and reminded him of all his promises, and still he told her that he did not and could not love her, and that his promises were nothing. Oberon was sorry for poor Helena, and when Puck returned with the flower, he bade him follow Demetrius and put some of the juice on his eyes, so that he might love Helena when he woke, and looked on her as much as she loved him. So Puck set off, and wandering through the wood found not Demetrius but Lysander, on whose eyes he put the juice. But when Lysander woke, he saw not his own Hermia, but Helena, who was walking through the wood looking for the cruel Demetrius, and directly he saw her he loved her, and left his own lady under the spell of the purple flower. When Hermia woke, she found Lysander gone, and wandered about the wood trying to find him. Puck went back and told Oberon what he had done, and Oberon soon found that he had made a mistake, and set about looking for Demetrius, and having found him, put some of the juice on his eyes. And the first thing Demetrius saw when he woke was also Helena. So now Demetrius and Lysander were both following her through the wood, and it was Hermia's turn to follow her lover as Helena had done before. The end of it was that Helena and Hermia began to quarrel, and Demetrius and Lysander went off to fight. Oberon was very sorry to see his kind scheme to help these lovers turn out so badly. So he said to Puck, "These two young men are going to fight. You must overhang the night with drooping fog, and lead them so astray that one will never find the other. When they are tired out, they will fall asleep. Then drop this other herb on Lysander's eyes. That will give him his old sight and his old love. Then each man will have the lady who loves him, and they will all think that this has been only a midsummer night's dream. Then when this is done, all will be well with them." So Puck went and did as he was told, and when the two had fallen asleep without meeting each other, Puck poured the juice on Lysander's eyes and said, "When thou wakest, thou takest true delight in the sight of thy former lady's eye. Jack shall have Jill, naught shall go ill." Meanwhile Oberon found Titania asleep on a bank where grew wild thyme, oxlips and violets and woodbine, musk roses and eglantine. There Titania always slept a part of the night, wrapped in the enamelled skin of a snake. Oberon stooped over her and laid the juice on her eyes, saying, "What thou seest when thou wake, do it for thy true love take."
Now, it happened that when Titania woke, the first thing she saw was a stupid clown, one of a party of players who had come out into the wood to rehearse their play.
This clown had met with Puck, who had clapped an ass's head on his shoulders, so that it looked as if it grew there. Directly Titania woke and saw this dreadful monster, she said, "What angel is this? Are you as wise as you are beautiful?" "If I am wise enough to find my way out of this wood, that's enough for me," said the foolish clown. "Do not desire to go out of the wood," said Titania. The spell of the love juice was on her, and to her the clown seemed the most beautiful and delightful creature on all the earth. "I love you," she went on. "Come with me, and I will give you fairies to attend on you." So she called 4 fairies, whose names were Peaseblossom, Cobweb, Moth, and Mustard Seed. "You must attend this gentleman," said the queen. "Feed him with apricots and dewberries, purple grapes, green figs, and mulberries. Steal honey bags for him from the bumblebees, and with the wings of painted butterflies fan the moonbeams from his sleeping eyes." "I will," said one of the fairies, and all the others said, "I will." "Now sit down with me," said the queen to the clown, "and let me stroke your dear cheeks, and stick musk roses in your smooth, sleek head, and kiss your fair large ears, my gentle joy. Where's Peaseblossoms?" asked the clown with the ass's head. He did not care much about the queen's affection, but he was very proud of having fairies to wait on him. "Ready?" said Peaseblossom. "Scratch my head, Peaseblossom," said the clown. "Where's Cobweb? Ready?" said Cobweb. "Kill me," said the clown, "the red bumblebee on the top of the thistle yonder, and bring me the honey bag. Where's Mustard Seed?"
"Ready," said Mustard Seed.
"Oh, I want nothing," said the clown. "Only just help Cobweb to scratch. I must go to the barber's, for methinks I am marvellous hairy about the face." "Would you like anything to eat?" said the fairy queen. "I should like some good dry oats," said the clown for his donkey's head, made him desire donkey's food, and some hay to follow. "Shall some of my fairies fetch you new nuts from the squirrel's house?" asked the queen. "I'd rather have a handful or 2 of good dried peas," said the clown. "But please don't let any of your people disturb me. I am going to sleep." Then said the queen, "And I will wind thee in my arms." And so when Oberon came along, he found his beautiful queen lavishing kisses and endearments on a clown with a donkey's head. And before he released her from the enchantment, he persuaded her to give him the little Indian boy he so much desired to have. Then he took pity on her, and threw some juice of the disenchanting flower on her pretty eyes, and then, in a moment, she saw plainly the donkey-headed clown she had been loving, and knew how foolish she had been. Oberon took off the ass's head from the clown, and left him to finish his sleep with his own silly head, lying on the thyme and violets. Thus all was made plain and straight again. Oberon and Titania loved each other more than ever. Demetrius thought of no one but Helena, and Helena had never had any thought of anyone but Demetrius. As for Hermia and Lysander, they were as loving a couple as you could meet in a day's march, even through a fairy wood. So the 4 mortal lovers went back to Athens and were married, and the fairy king and queen live happily together in that very wood at this very day. The Tempest. Prospero, the Duke of Milan, was a learned and studious man who lived among his books, leaving the management of his dukedom to his brother Antonio, in whom indeed he had complete trust. But that trust was ill rewarded, for Antonio wanted to wear the duke's crown himself, and, to gain his ends, would have killed his brother but for the love the people bore him. However, with the help of Prospero's great enemy, Alonso, King of Naples, he managed to get into his hands the dukedom with all its honour, power, and riches. for they took Prospero to sea, and when they were far away from land, forced him into a little boat with no tackle, mast, or sail. In their cruelty and hatred, they put his little daughter, Miranda, not yet 3 years old, into the boat with him, and sailed away, leaving them to their fate. But one among the courtiers with Antonio was true to his rightful master, Prospero. To save the Duke from his enemies was impossible, but much could be done to remind him of a subject's love. So this worthy lord, whose name was Gonzalo, secretly placed in the boat some fresh water, provisions and clothes, and what Prospero valued most of all, some of his precious books. The boat was cast on an island, and Prospero and his little one landed in safety. Now this island was enchanted, and for years had lain under the spell of a fell witch, Sycorax, who had imprisoned in the trunks of trees all the good spirits she found there. She died shortly before Prospero was cast on those shores, but the spirits, of whom Ariel was the chief, still remained in their prisons. Prospero was a great magician, for he had devoted himself almost entirely to the study of magic during the years in which he allowed his brother to manage the affairs of Milan. By his art he set free the imprisoned spirits, yet kept them obedient to his will, and they were more truly his subjects than his people in Milan had been, for he treated them kindly as long as they did his bidding, and he exercised his power over them wisely and well. One creature alone he found it necessary to treat with harshness. This was Caliban, the son of the wicked old witch, a hideous, deformed monster, horrible to look on, and vicious and brutal in all his habits. When Miranda was grown up into a maiden, sweet and fair to see, it chanced that Antonio and Alonso, with Sebastian, his brother, and Ferdinand, his son, were at sea together with old Gonzalo, and their ship came near Prospero's island. Prospero, knowing they were there, raised by his art a great storm, so that even the sailors on board gave themselves up for lost. And first among them all Prince Ferdinand leaped into the sea, and, as his father thought in his grief, was drowned, but Ariel brought him safe ashore. And all the rest of the crew, although they were washed overboard, were landed unhurt in different parts of the island, and the good ship herself, which they all thought had been wrecked, lay at anchor in the harbour whither Ariel had brought her. Such wonders could Prospero and his spirits perform. While yet the tempest was raging, Prospero showed his daughter the brave ship labouring in the trough of the sea, and told her that it was filled with living human beings like themselves. She, in pity of their lives, prayed him who had raised this storm to quell it. Then her father bade her to have no fear, for he intended to save every one of them. Then, for the first time, he told her the story of his life and hers, and that he had caused this storm to rise in order that his enemies Antonio and Alonso, who were on board, might be delivered into his hands. When he had made an end of his story, he charmed her into sleep, for Ariel was at hand, and he had work for him to do. Ariel, who longed for his complete freedom, grumbled to be kept in drudgery, but on being threateningly reminded of all the sufferings he had undergone when Sycorax ruled in the land, and of the debt of gratitude he owed to the master who had made those sufferings to end, he ceased to complain, and promised faithfully to do whatever Prospero might command. "Do so," said Prospero, "and in 2 days I will discharge thee." Then he bade Ariel take the form of a water nymph, and sent him in search of the young prince, and Ariel, invisible to Ferdinand, hovered near him, singing the while, "Come unto these yellow sands, and then take hands, courtesied when you have, and kissed, the wild waves whist, foot it featly here and there, and sweet sprites the burden bear, and Ferdinand followed the magic singing, as the song changed to a solemn air, and the words brought grief to his heart and tears to his eyes, for thus they ran full fathom: 5 thy father lies, of his bones are coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes, nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange. Sea nymphs hourly ring his knell, hark! Now I hear them ding-dong bell. And so singing, Ariel led the spellbound prince into the presence of Prospero and Miranda. Then, behold, all happened as Prospero desired. For Miranda, who had never, since she could first remember, seen any human being save her father, looked on the youthful prince with reverence in her eyes and love in her secret heart. I might call him, she said, a thing divine for nothing natural I ever saw so noble. And Ferdinand, beholding her beauty with wonder and delight, exclaimed, most sure the goddess on whom these airs attend. Nor did he attempt to hide the passion which she inspired in him, for scarcely had they exchanged 6 sentences before he vowed to make her his queen, if she were willing. But Prospero, though secretly delighted, pretended wrath. You come here as a spy, he said to Ferdinand. I will manacle your neck and feet together, and you shall feed on fresh water mussels, withered roots and husk, and have sea water to drink. Follow no, said Ferdinand, and drew his sword. But on the instant Prospero charmed him so that he stood there like a statue, still as stone, and Miranda in terror prayed her father to have mercy on her lover. But he harshly refused her and made Ferdinand follow him to his cell. There he set the prince to work, making him remove thousands of heavy logs of timber and pile them up. And Ferdinand patiently obeyed, and thought his toil all too well repaid by the sympathy of the sweet Miranda. She, in very pity, would have helped him in his hard work, but he would not let her. Yet he could not keep from her the secret of his love, and she, hearing it, rejoiced and promised to be his wife. Then Prospero released him from his servitude, and glad at heart he gave his consent to their marriage. Take her, he said, she is thine own. In the meantime, Antonio and Sebastian, in another part of the island, were plotting the murder of Alonso, the King of Naples, for Ferdinand being dead, as they thought, Sebastian would succeed to the throne on Alonso's death, and they would have carried out their wicked purpose while their victim was asleep, but that Ariel woke him in good time. Many tricks did Ariel play them. Once he set a banquet before them, and just as they were going to fall to, he appeared to them amid thunder and lightning in the form of a harpy, and immediately the banquet disappeared. Then Ariel upbraided them with their sins and vanished too. Prospero, by his enchantments, drew them all to the grove without his cell, where they waited, trembling and afraid, and now at last bitterly repenting them of their sins. Prospero determined to make one last use of his magic power, and then, said he, I'll break my staff, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book. So he made heavenly music to sound in the air, and appear to them in his proper shape as the Duke of Milan. Because they repented, he forgave them, and told them the story of his life since they had cruelly committed him and his baby daughter to the mercy of wind and waves. Alonso, who seemed sorriest of them all for his past crimes, lamented the loss of his heir, but Prospero drew back a curtain and showed them Ferdinand and Miranda playing at chess. Great was Alonso's joy to greet his loved son again, and when he heard that the fair maid with whom Ferdinand was playing was Prospero's daughter, and that the young folks had plighted their troth, he said, Give me your hands, let grief and sorrow still embrace his heart, that doth not wish you joy. So all ended happily. The ship was safe in the harbour, and next day they all set sail for Naples, where Ferdinand and Miranda were to be married. Ariel gave them calm seas and auspicious gales, and many were the rejoicings at the wedding. Then Prospero, after many years of absence, went back to his own dukedom, where he was welcomed with great joy by his faithful subjects. He practised the arts of magic no more, but his life was happy, and not only because he had found his own again, but chiefly because, when his bitterest foes, who had done him deadly wrong, lay at his mercy, he took no vengeance on them, but nobly forgave them. As for Ariel, Prospero made him free as air, so that he could wander where he would, and sing with a light heart his sweet song where the bee sucks, there suck I. In a cowslip's bell I lie. There I couch when owls do cry. On the bat's back I do fly after summer. Merrily, merrily, merrily. Merrily, merrily, live now, under the blossom that hangs on the bough. As you like it. There was once a wicked duke named Frederick, who took the dukedom that should have belonged to his brother, sending him into exile. His brother went into the forest of Arden, where he lived the life of a bold forester, as Robin Hood did in Sherwood Forest in merry England. The banished duke's daughter, Rosalind, remained with Celia, Frederick's daughter, and the two loved each other more than most sisters. One day there was a wrestling match at court, and Rosalind and Celia went to see it. Charles, a celebrated wrestler, was there, who had killed many men in contests of this kind. Orlando, the young man he was to wrestle with, was so slender and youthful that Rosalind and Celia thought he would surely be killed, as others had been. So they spoke to him and asked him not to attempt so dangerous an adventure. But the only effect of their words was to make him wish more to come off well in the encounter, so as to win praise from such sweet ladies.
Orlando, like Rosalind's father, was being kept out of his inheritance by his brother, and was so sad at his brother, and was so sad at his brother's unkindness, that, until he saw Rosalind, he did not care much whether he lived or died.
But now the sight of the fair Rosalind gave him strength and courage, so that he did marvellously, and at last threw Charles to such a tune that the wrestler had to be carried off the ground. Duke Frederick was pleased with his courage, and asked his name. "My name is Orlando, and I am the youngest son of Sir Rowland de Boys," said the young man. Now Sir Rowland de Boys, when he was alive, had been a good friend to the banished duke, so that Frederick heard with regret whose son Orlando was, and would not befriend him. But Rosalind was delighted to hear that this handsome young stranger was the son of her father's old friend, and as they were going away, she turned back more than once to say another kind word to the brave young man. "Gentlemen," she said, giving him a chain from her neck, "wear this for me. I could give more, but that my hand lacks means." Rosalind and Celia, when they were alone, began to talk about the handsome wrestler, and Rosalind confessed that she loved him at first sight. "Come, come," said Celia, "wrestle with thy affections." "Oh," answered Rosalind, "they take the part of a better wrestler than myself." "Look, here comes the Duke, with his eyes full of anger," said Celia. "You must leave the court at once," he said to Rosalind. "Why?" she asked. "Never mind why," answered the Duke. "You are banished. If within 10 days you are found within 20 miles of my court, you die." So Rosalind set out to seek her father, the banished Duke, in the forest of Arden. Celia loved her too much to let her go alone, and as it was rather a dangerous journey, Rosalind, being the taller, dressed up as a young countryman, and her cousin as a country girl, and Rosalind said that she would be called Ganymede, and Celia Aliena. They were very tired when at last they came to the forest of Arden, and as they were sitting on the grass a countryman passed that way, and Ganymede asked him if he could get them food. He did so, and told them that a shepherd's flocks and house were to be sold. They bought these and settled down as shepherd and shepherdess in the forest. In the meantime, Oliver having sought to take his brother Orlando's life, Orlando also wandered into the forest, and there met with the rightful duke, and being kindly received, stayed with him. Now, Orlando could think of nothing but Rosalind, and he went about the forest carving her name on trees, and writing love sonnets, and hanging them on the bushes, and there Rosalind and Celia found them. One day Orlando met them, but he did not know Rosalind in her boy's clothes, though he liked the pretty shepherd youth, because he fancied a likeness in him to her he loved. "There is a foolish lover," said Rosalind, "who haunts these woods and hangs sonnets on the trees. If I could find him, I would soon cure him of his folly." Orlando confessed that he was the foolish lover, and Rosalind said, "If you will come and see me every day, I will pretend to be Rosalind, and I will take her part, and be wayward and contrary, as is the way of women, till I make you ashamed of your folly in loving her." And so every day he went to her house, and took a pleasure in saying to her all the pretty things he would have said to Rosalind. And she had the fine and secret joy of knowing that all his love words came to the right ears. Thus many days passed pleasantly away. One morning, as Orlando was going to visit Ganymede, he saw a man asleep on the ground, and that there was a lioness crouching near, waiting for the man who was asleep to wake, for they say that lions will not prey on anything that is dead or sleeping. Then Orlando looked at the man, and saw that it was his wicked brother, Oliver, who had tried to take his life. He fought with the lioness and killed her, and saved his brother's life. While Orlando was fighting the lioness, Oliver woke to see his brother, whom he had treated so badly, saving him from a wild beast at the risk of his own life. This made him repent of his wickedness, and he begged Orlando's pardon, and from thenceforth they were dear brothers. The lioness had wounded Orlando's arm so much that he could not go on to see the shepherd, so he sent his brother to ask Ganymede to come to him. Oliver went and told the whole story to Ganymede and Aliena, and Aliena was so charmed with his manly way of confessing his faults that she fell in love with him at once. But when Ganymede heard of the danger Orlando had been in, she fainted, and when she came to herself said, "Truly enough, I should have been a woman by right." Oliver went back to his brother and told him all this, saying, "I love Aliena so well that I will give up my estates to you and marry her, and live here as a shepherd." "Let your wedding be tomorrow," said Orlando, "and I will ask the Duke and his friends." When Orlando told Ganymede how his brother was to be married on the morrow, he added, "Oh, how bitter a thing it is to look into happiness through another man's eyes." Then answered Rosalind, still in Ganymede's dress and speaking with his voice, "If you do love Rosalind so near the heart, then when your brother marries Aliena, shall you marry her?" Now the next day, the Duke and his followers, and Orlando and Oliver, and Aliena were all gathered together for the wedding. Then Ganymede came in and said to the Duke, "If I bring in your daughter Rosalind, will you give her to Orlando here?" "That I would," said the Duke, "if I had all kingdoms to give with her. And you say you will have her when I bring her," she said to Orlando.
"Why would I?" he answered. "Well, I'm king of all kingdoms."
Then Rosalind and Celia went out, and Rosalind put on her pretty woman's clothes again, and after a while came back. She turned to her father. "I give myself to you, for I am yours. If there be truth in sight," he said, "you are my daughter." Then she said to Orlando, "I give myself to you, for I am yours." "If there be truth in sight," he said, "you are my Rosalind." "I will have no father, if you be not he," she said to the Duke, and to Orlando, "I will have no husband, if you be not he." So Orlando and Rosalind were married, and Oliver and Celia, and they lived happy ever after, returning with the Duke to the kingdom. For Frederick had been shown by a holy hermit the wickedness of his ways, and so gave back the dukedom of his brother, and himself went into a monastery to pray for forgiveness. The wedding was a merry one, in the mossy glades of the forest. A shepherd and shepherdess who had been friends with Rosalind when she was herself disguised as a shepherd were married on the same day, and all with such pretty feastings and merrymakings as could be nowhere within 4 walls, but only in the beautiful green wood. The Winter's Tale. Leontes was the king of Sicily, and his dearest friend was Polixenes, king of Bohemia. They had been brought up together, and only separated when they reached man's estate, and each had to go and rule over his kingdom. After many years, when each was married and had a son, Polixenes came to stay with Leontes in Sicily. Leontes was a violent-tempered man and rather silly, and he took it into his stupid head that his wife, Hermione, liked Polixenes better than she did him, her own husband. When once he had got this into his head, nothing could put it out. And he ordered one of his lords, Camillo, to put a poison in Polixenes' wine. Camillo tried to dissuade him from this wicked action, but finding he was not to be moved, pretended to consent. He then told Polixenes what was proposed against him, and they fled from the court of Sicily that night, and returned to Bohemia, where Camillo lived on as Polixenes' friend and counsellor. Leontes threw the queen into prison, and her son, the heir to the throne, died of sorrow to see his mother so unjustly and cruelly treated. While the queen was in prison, she had a little baby, and a friend of hers, named Paulina, had the baby dressed in its best, and took it to show the king, thinking that the sight of his helpless little daughter would soften his heart towards his dear queen, who had never done him any wrong, and who loved him a great deal more than he deserved. But the king would not look at the baby, and ordered Paulina's husband to take it away in a ship and leave it in the most desert and dreadful place he could find, which Paulina's husband, very much against his will, was obliged to do. Then the poor queen was brought up to be tried for treason in preferring Polixenes to her king. But really, she had never thought of anyone except Leontes, her husband. Leontes had sent some messengers to ask the god, Apollo, whether he was not right in his cruel thoughts of the queen. But he had not patience to wait till they came back, and so it happened that they arrived in the middle of the trial. The oracle said Hermione is innocent, Polixenes blameless, Camillo a true subject, Leontes a jealous tyrant, and the king shall live without an heir, if that which is lost be not found. Then a man came and told them that the little prince was dead. The poor queen, hearing this, fell down in a fit, and then the king saw how wicked and wrong he had been. He ordered Paulina and the ladies, who were with the queen, to take her away and try to restore her, but Paulina came back in a few moments and told the king that Hermione was dead. Now Leontes' eyes were at last opened to his folly. His queen was dead, and the little daughter who might have been a comfort to him he had sent away to be the prey of wolves and kites. Life had nothing left for him now. He gave himself up to his grief, and passed in any sad years in prayer and remorse. The baby princess was left on the sea-coast of Bohemia, the very kingdom where Polixenes reigned. Paulina's husband never went home to tell Leontes where he had left the baby, for as he was going back to the ship he met a bear and was torn to pieces. So there was an end of him, but the poor deserted little baby was found by a shepherd. She was richly dressed and had with her some jewels, and a paper was pinned to her cloak, saying that her name was Perdita, and that she came of noble parents. The shepherd, being a kind-hearted man, took home the little baby to his wife, and they brought it up as their own child. She had no more teaching than a shepherd's child generally has, but she inherited from her royal mother many graces and charms, so that she was quite different from the other maidens in the village where she lived. One day, Prince Florizel, the son of the good king of Bohemia, was bunting near the shepherd's house, and saw Perdita, now grown up to a charming woman. He made friends with the shepherd, not telling him that he was the prince, but saying that his name was Doricles, and that he was a private gentleman. And then, being deeply in love with the pretty Perdita, he came almost daily to see her. The king could not understand what it was that took his son nearly every day from home. So he set people to watch him, and then found out that the heir of the King of Bohemia was in love with Perdita, the pretty shepherd girl. Polixenes, wishing to see whether this was true, disguised himself and went with the faithful Camillo, in disguise too, to the old shepherd's house. They arrived at the feast of sheep-shearing, and though strangers, they were made very welcome. There was dancing going on, and a pedlar was selling ribbons and laces and gloves, which the young men bought for their sweethearts. Florizel and Perdita, however, were taking no part in this gay scene, but sat quietly together talking. The king noticed the charming manners and great beauty of Perdita, never guessing that she was the daughter of his old friend, Leontes. He said to Camillo, "This is the prettiest low-born lass that ever ran on the green sward. Nothing she does or seems but smacks of something greater than herself, too noble for this place." And Camillo answered, "In truth, she is the queen of curds and cream." But when Florizel, who did not recognize his father, called upon the strangers to witness his betrothal with the pretty shepherdess, the king made himself known and forbade the marriage, adding that if ever she saw Florizel again, he would kill her and her old father, the shepherd, and with that he left them. But Camillo remained behind, for he was charmed with Perdita, and wished to befriend her. Camillo had long known how sorry Leontes was for that foolish madness of his, and he longed to go back to Sicily to see his old master. He now proposed that the young people should go there and claim the protection of Leontes. So they went, and the shepherd went with them, taking Perdita's jewels, her baby clothes, and the paper he had found pinned to her cloak. Leontes received them with great kindness. He was very polite to Prince Florizel, but all his looks were for Perdita. He saw how much she was like the Queen Hermione, and said again and again, "Such a sweet creature my daughter might have been, if I had not cruelly sent her from me." When the old shepherd heard that the king had lost a baby daughter, who had been left upon the coast of Bohemia, he felt sure that Perdita, the child he had reared, must be the king's daughter, and when he told his tale and showed the jewels and the paper, the king perceived that Perdita was indeed his long-lost child. He welcomed her with joy and rewarded the good shepherd. Polixenes had hastened after his son to prevent his marriage with Perdita, but when he found that she was the daughter of his old friend, he was only too glad to give his consent. Yet Leontes could not be happy. He remembered how his fair queen, who should have been at his side to share his joy in his daughter's happiness, was dead through his unkindness, and he could say nothing for a long time but, "Oh, thy mother, thy mother, thy mother," and ask forgiveness of the King of Bohemia, and then kiss his daughter again, and then the Prince Florizel, and then thank the old shepherd for all his goodness. Then Paulina, who had been high all these years in the king's favour because of her kindness to the dead Queen Hermione, said, "I have a statue made in the likeness of the dead queen, a piece many years in doing, and performed by the rare Italian master, Giulio Romano. I keep it in a private house, apart, and there, ever since you lost your queen, I have gone twice or thrice a day. Will it please your majesty to go and see the statue?" So Leontes and Polixenes and Florizel and Perdita, with Camillo and their attendants, went to Paulina's house, where there was a heavy purple curtain screening off an alcove, and Paulina, with her hand on the curtain, said she was peerless when she was alive, and I do believe that her dead likeness excels whatever yet you have looked upon, or that the hand of man hath done. Therefore I keep it lonely apart. But here it is, behold, and say, "'Tis well," and with that she drew back the curtain and showed them the statue. The king gazed and gazed on the beautiful statue of his dead wife, but said nothing. "I like your silence," said Paulina. "It the more shows off your wonder." "It the more shows off your wonder. But speak, is it not like her? It is almost herself," said the king. And yet Paulina, Hermione, was not so much wrinkled, nothing so old as this seems. "Oh, not by much," said Polixenes. "Al," said Paulina, "that is the cleverness of the carver, who shows her to us as she would have been had she lived till now." And still Leontes looked at the statue and could not take his eyes away. "If I had known," said Paulina, "that this poor image would so have stirred your grief and love, I would not have shown it to you." But he only answered, "Do not draw the curtain. No, you must not look any longer," said Paulina, "or you will think it moves." Let be, said the king. "Would you not think it breathed?" "I will draw the curtain," said Paulina. "You will think it lives presently." "Ah, sweet Paulina, said Leontes, make me to think so 20 years together. If you can bear it, said Paulina, I can make the statue move, make it come down and take you by the hand. Only you would think it was by wicked magic. Whatever you can make her do, I am content to look on," said the king. And then, all folks there admiring and beholding, the statue moved from its pedestal and came down the steps and put its arms round the king's neck, and he held her face and kissed her many times, for this was no statue, but the real living Queen Hermione herself. She had lived hidden by Paulina's kindness all these years, and would not discover herself to her husband, though she knew he had repented, because she could not quite forgive him till she knew what had become of her little baby. Now that Perdita was found, she forgave her husband everything, and it was like a new and beautiful marriage to them, to be together once more. Florizel and Perdita were married and lived long and happily. To Leontes his many years of suffering were well paid for in the moment when, after long grief and pain, he felt the arms of his true love around him once again. King Lear was old and tired. He was aweary of the business of his kingdom, and wished only to end his days quietly near his 3 daughters. 2 of his daughters were married to the Dukes of Albany and Cornwall, and the Duke of Burgundy and the King of France were both suitors for the hand of Cordelia, his youngest daughter. Lear called his 3 daughters together and told them that he proposed to divide his kingdom between them. "But first," said he, "I should like to know much. You love me." Goneril, who was really a very wicked woman, and did not love her father at all, said she loved him more than words could say. She loved him dearer than eyesight, space or liberty, more than life, grace, health, beauty, and honour. "I love you as much as my sister and more," professed Regan, "since I care for nothing but my father's love." Lear was very much pleased with Regan's professions, and turned to his youngest daughter, Cordelia. "Now our joy, though last not least," he said, "the best part of my kingdom have I kept for you." "What can you say?" "Nothing, my lord," answered Cordelia. "Nothing can come of nothing." "Speak again," said the king. And Cordelia answered, "I love your majesty according to my duty, no more, no less." And this she said because she was disgusted with the way in which her sisters professed love, when really they had not even a right sense of duty to their old father. "I am your daughter," she went on, "and you have brought me up and loved me, and I return you those duties back, as are right and fit, obey you, love you, and most honour you." Lear, who loved Cordelia best, had wished her to make more extravagant professions of love than her sisters. "Go," he said. "Be forever a stranger to my heart and me." The Earl of Kent, one of Lear's favourite courtiers and captains, tried to say a word for Cordelia's sake, but Lear would not listen. He divided the kingdom between Goneril and Regan, and told them that he should only keep 100 knights at arms, and would live with his daughters by turns. When the Duke of Burgundy knew that Cordelia would have no share of the kingdom, he gave up his courtship of her. But the King of France was wiser, and said, "Thy dowerless daughter, King, is queen of us of ours, and our fair France. Take her, said the king, for I will never see that face of hers again. So Cordelia became Queen of France, and the Earl of Kent, for having ventured to take her part, was banished from the kingdom. The king now went to stay with his daughter Goneril, who had got everything from her father that he had to give, and now began to grudge even the 100 knights that he had reserved for himself. She was harsh and undutiful to him, and her servants either refused to obey his orders or pretended that they did not hear them. Now the Earl of Kent, when he was banished, made as though he would go into another country, but instead he came back in the disguise of a servingman and took service with the king. The king had now 2 friends, the Earl of Kent, whom he only knew as his servant and his fool, who was faithful to him. Goneril told her father plainly that his knights only served to fill her court with riot and feasting, and so she begged him only to keep a few old men about him, such as himself. "My train are men who know all parts of duty," said Lear. "Goneril, I will not trouble you further yet. I have left another daughter." And his horses being saddled, he set out with his followers for the castle of Regan. But she, who had formerly outdone her sister in professions of attachment to the king, now seemed to outdo her in undutiful conduct, saying that 50 knights were too many to wait on him, and Goneril, who had hurried thither to prevent Regan showing any kindness to the old king, said 5 were too many, since her servants could wait on him. Then when Lear saw that what they really wanted was to drive him away, he left them. It was a wild and stormy night, and he wandered about the heath half mad with misery, and with no companion but the poor fool. But presently his servant, the good Earl of Kent, met him, and at last persuaded him to lie down in a wretched little hovel. At daybreak the Earl of Kent removed his royal master to Dover, and hurried to the court of France to tell Cordelia what had happened. Cordelia's husband gave her an army, and with it she landed at Dover. Here she found poor King Lear wandering about the fields, wearing a crown of nettles and weeds. They brought him back and fed and clothed him, and Cordelia came to him and kissed him. "You must bear with me," said Lear. "Forget and forgive. I am old and foolish." And now he knew at last which of his children it was that had loved him best, and who was worthy of his love. Goneril and Regan joined their armies to fight Cordelia's army, and were successful. And Cordelia and her father were thrown into prison. Then Goneril's husband, the Duke of Albany, who was a good man, and had not known how wicked his wife was, heard the truth of the whole story. And when Goneril found that her husband knew her for the wicked woman she was, she killed herself, having a little time before given a deadly poison to her sister, Regan, out of a spirit of jealousy. But they had arranged that Cordelia should be hanged in prison, and though the Duke of Albany sent messengers at once, it was too late. The old king came staggering into the tent of the Duke of Albany, carrying the body of his dear daughter Cordelia in his arms. And soon after, with words of love for her upon his lips, he fell with her still in his arms and died. 12th night. Orsino, the Duke of Illyria, was deeply in love with a beautiful countess named Olivia. Yet was all his love in vain, for she disdained his suit, and when her brother died she sent back a messenger from the Duke, bidding him tell his master that for 7 years she would not let the very air behold her face, but that, like a nun, she would walk veiled, and all this for the sake of a nun. She would walk veiled, and all this for the sake of a dead brother's love, which she would keep fresh and lasting in her sad remembrance. The Duke longed for someone to whom he could tell his sorrow, and repeat over and over again the story of his love, and chance brought him such a companion. For about this time a goodly ship was wrecked on the Illyrian coast, and among those who reached land in safety were the captain and a fair young maid named Viola. But she was little grateful for being rescued from the perils of the sea, since she feared that her twin brother was drowned. Sebastian, as dear to her as the heart in her bosom, and so like her that, but for the difference in their manner of dress, one could hardly be told from the other. The captain, for her comfort, told her that he had seen her brother bind himself to a strong mast that lived upon the sea, and that thus there was hope that he might be saved. Viola now asked in whose country she was, and learning that the young Duke Orsino ruled there, and was as noble in his nature as in his name, she decided to disguise herself in male attire and seek for employment with him as a page. In this she succeeded, and now from day to day she had to listen to the story of Orsino's love. At first she sympathized very truly with him, but soon her sympathy grew to love. At last it occurred to Orsino that his hopeless love-suit might prosper better if he sent this pretty lad to woo Olivia for him. Viola unwillingly went on this errand, but when she came to the house, Malvolio, Olivia's steward, a vain, officious man, sick, as his mistress told him, of self-love, forbade the messenger admittance. Viola, however, who was now called Cesario, refused to take any denial, and vowed to have speech with the countess. Olivia, hearing how her instructions were defied and curious to see this daring youth, said, "Well, once more hear Orsino's embassy." When Viola was admitted to her presence and the servants had been sent away, she listened patiently to the reproaches which this bold messenger from the Duke poured upon her, and listening she fell in love with the supposed Cesario. And when Cesario had gone, Olivia longed to send some love token. "After him!" So, calling Malvolio, she bade him follow the boy. "He had left this ring behind him," she said, taking one from her finger. "Tell him I will none of it." Malvolio did as he was bid, and then Viola, who of course knew perfectly well that she had left no ring behind her, saw with a woman's quickness that Olivia loved her. Then she went back to the Duke, very sad at heart for her lover, and for Olivia, and for herself. It was but cold comfort she could give Orsino, who now sought to ease the pangs of despised love by listening to sweet music, while Cesario stood by his side. "Ah," said the Duke to his page that night, "you too have been in love." "What kind of woman is it?" he asked. "Of your complexion," she answered. "What years, I' faith?" was his next question. To this came the pretty answer about your years, my lord. "Too old, by heaven." Cried the Duke, "Let still the woman take an elder than herself." And Viola very meekly said, "I think it well, my lord." By and by Orsino begged Cesario once more to visit Olivia and to plead his love-suit, but she, thinking to dissuade him, said, "If some lady loves you as you love Olivia—" "Ah, that cannot be," said the Duke. "But I know," Viola went on, "what love woman may have for a man. My father had a daughter loved a man, as it might be," she added, blushing perhaps. "Were I a woman, I should love your lordship." "And what is her history?" he asked. "A blank, my lord," Viola answered. She never told her love, but let concealment like a worm in the bud feed on her damask cheek. She pined in thought, and with a green and yellow melancholy she sat like Patience on a monument, smiling at grief. Was not this love indeed? "But died thy sister of her love, my boy?" the Duke asked. And Viola, who had all the time been telling her own love for him in this pretty fashion, said, "I am all the daughters my father has, and all the daughters my father has, and all the brothers, sir. Shall I go to the lady," said the Duke, at once forgetting all about the story, "and give her this jewel?" So Viola went, and this time poor Olivia was unable to hide her love, and openly confessed it with such passionate truth that Viola left her hastily, saying, "Never more will I deplore my master's tears to you." But in vowing this, Viola did not know the tender pity she would feel for others' suffering. So when Olivia, in the violence of her love, sent a messenger, praying Cesario to visit her once more, Cesario had no heart to refuse the request. But the favours which Olivia bestowed upon this mere page aroused the jealousy of Sir Andrew Aguacheek, a foolish, rejected lover of hers, who at that time was staying at her house with her merry old uncle Sir Toby. This same Sir Toby dearly loved a practical joke, and knowing Sir Andrew to be an arrant coward, he thought that if he could bring off a duel between him and Cesario, there would be rare sport indeed. So he induced Sir Andrew to send a challenge, which he himself took to Cesario. The poor page, in great terror, said, "I will return again to the house. I am no fighter." "Back you shall not to the house," said Sir Tobo, "unless you fight me first." And as he looked a very fierce old gentleman, Viola thought it best to await Sir Andrew's coming. And when he at last made his appearance, in a great fright, if the truth had been known, she tremblingly drew her sword, and Sir Andrew, in like fear, followed her example. Happily for them both, at this moment, some officers of the court came on the scene and stopped the intended duel. Viola gladly made off with what speed she might, while Sir Toby called after her a very paltry boy, and more a coward than a hare. Now, while these things were happening, Sebastian had escaped all the dangers of the deep, and had landed safely in Illyria, where he determined to make his way to the Duke's court. On his way thither, he passed Olivia's house just as Viola had left it in such a hurry, and whom should he meet but Sir Andrew and Sir Toby? Sir Andrew, mistaking Sebastian for the cowardly Cesario, took his courage in both hands, and walking up to him struck him, saying, "There's for you." "Why, there's for you, and there, said Sebastian, biting back a great deal harder, and again, till Sir Toby came to the rescue of his friend. Sebastian, however, tore himself free from Sir Toby's clutches, and drawing his sword would have fought them both. But that Olivia herself, having heard of the quarrel, came running in, and with many reproaches sent Sir Toby and his friend away. Then turning to Sebastian, whom she too thought to be Cesario, she besought him with many a pretty speech to come into the house with her. Sebastian, half dazed and all delighted with her beauty and grace, readily consented, and that very day, so great was Olivia's baste. They were married before she had discovered that he was not Cesario, or Sebastian was quite certain whether or not he was in a dream. Meanwhile Orsino, hearing how ill Cesario sped with Olivia, visited her himself, taking Cesario with him. Olivia met them both before her door, and seeing, as she thought, her husband there, reproached him for leaving her, while to the Duke she said that his suit was as fat and wholesome to her as howling after music. "Still so cruel," said Orsino. "Still so constant," she answered. Then Orsino's anger growing to cruelty, he vowed that, to be revenged on her, he would kill Cesario, whom he knew she loved. "Come, boy," he said to the page, and Viola, following him as he moved away, said, "Aye, to do you rest, 1,000 deaths would die." A great fear took hold on Olivia, and she cried aloud, "Cesario, husband!" "Stay, her husband?" asked the Duke angrily. "No, my lord, not I," said Viola. "Call forth the Holy Father," cried Olivia, and the priest who had married Sebastian and Olivia coming in, declared Cesario to be the bridegroom. "O thou dissembling cub!" the Duke exclaimed, "farewell, and take her. But go where thou and I henceforth may never meet." At this moment Sir Andrew came up with bleeding crown, complaining that Cesario had broken his head, and Sir Toby's as well. "I never hurt you," said Viola, very positively. "You drew your sword on me, but I bespoke you fair, and hurt you not." Yet for all her protesting no one there believed her, but all their thoughts were on a sudden change to wonder when Sebastian came in. "I am sorry, madam," he said to his wife. "I have hurt your kinsman. Pardon me, sweet, even for the vows we made each other so late ago. One face, one voice, one habit, and two persons," cried the Duke, looking first at Viola and then at Sebastian. "An apple cleft in two," said one who knew Sebastian is not more twin than these two creatures. "Which is Sebastian?" "I never had a brother," said Sebastian. "I had a sister, whom the blind waves and surges have devoured." "Were you a woman?" he said to Viola. "I should let my tears fall upon your cheek, and say, 'Thrice welcome, drowned Viola.'" Then Viola, rejoicing to see her dear brother alive, confessed that she was indeed his sister Viola. As she spoke, Orsino felt the pity that is akin to love. "Boy," he said, "thou hast said to me 1,000 times thou never shouldst love woman like to me, and all those sayings will I overswear," Viola replied, "and all those sayings keep true." "Give me thy hand," Orsino cried in gladness. "Thou shalt be my wife and my fancy's queen." Thus was the gentle Viola made happy, while Olivia found in Sebastian a constant lover and a good husband, and he in her a true and loving wife. Much ado about nothing. In Sicily is a town called Messina, which is the scene of a curious storm in a teacup that raged several 100 years ago. It began with sunshine. Don Pedro, Prince of Aragon, in Spain, had gained so complete a victory over his foes that the very land whence they came is forgotten. Feeling happy and playful after the fatigues of war, Don Pedro came for a holiday to Messina, and in his suite were his step-brother Don John and 2 young Italian lords, Benedick and Claudio. Benedick was a merry chatterbox who had determined to live a bachelor. Claudio, on the other hand, no sooner arrived at Messina than he fell in love with Hero, the daughter of Leonato, governor of Messina. One July day, a perfumer called Borachio was burning dried lavender in a musty room in Leonato's house when the sound of conversation floated through the open window.
"Give me your candid opinion of Hero," Claudio asked, and Borachio settled himself for comfortable listening.
"Too short and brown for praise," was Benedick's reply. "But alter her colour or height, and you spoil her." "In my eyes she is the sweetest of women," said Claudio. "Not in mine," retorted Benedick, "and I have no need for glasses. She is like the last day of December compared with the 1st of May if you set her beside her cousin. Unfortunately, the Lady Beatrice is a fury. Beatrice is a fury. Beatrice is a fury." Beatrice was Leonato's niece. She amused herself by saying witty and severe things about Benedick, who called her Dear Lady Disdain. She was wont to say that she was born under a dancing star, and could not therefore be dull. Claudio and Benedick were still talking when Don Pedro came up and said good-humouredly, "Well, gentlemen, what's the secret?" "I am longing," answered Benedick, "for your grace to command me to tell." "I charge you then on your allegiance to tell me," said Don Pedro, falling in with his humour. "I can be as dumb as a mute," apologized Benedick to Claudio, "but his grace commands my speech." To Don Pedro he said, "Claudio is in love with Hero, Leonato's short daughter."
Don Pedro was pleased, for he admired Hero and was fond of Claudio.
When Benedick had departed, he said to Claudio, "Be steadfast in your love for Hero, and I will help you to win her. Tonight her father gives a masquerade, and I will pretend I am Claudio, and tell her how Claudio loves her, and if she be pleased, I will go to her father and ask his consent to your union." Most men like to do their own wooing, but if you fall in love with a governor's only daughter, you are fortunate if you can trust a prince to plead for you. Claudio then was fortunate, but he was unfortunate as well. For he had an enemy who was outwardly a friend. This enemy was Don Pedro's stepbrother Don John, who was jealous of Claudio because Don Pedro preferred him to Don John. It was to Don John that Borachio came with the interesting conversation which he had overheard. "I shall have some fun at that masquerade myself," said Don John when Borachio ceased speaking. On the night of the masquerade, Don Pedro, masked and pretending he was Claudio, asked Hero if he might walk with her. They moved away together, and Don John went up to Claudio and said, "Signor Benedick, I believe." "The same fib, Claudio." "I should be much obliged then," said Don John, "if you would use your influence with my brother to cure him of his love for Hero. She is beneath him in rank." "How do you know he loves her?" inquired Claudio. "I heard him swear his affection," was the reply. And Borachio chimed in with, "So did I too."
Claudio was then left to himself, and his thought was that his prince had betrayed him.
"Farewell, Hero," he muttered. "I was a fool to trust to an agent." Meanwhile Beatrice and Benedick, who was masked, were having a brisk exchange of opinions. "Did Benedick ever make you laugh?" asked she. "Who is Benedick?" he inquired. "A prince's jester," replied Beatrice, "and she spoke so sharply that I would not marry her," he declared afterwards, "if her estate were the Garden of Eden." But the principal speaker at the masquerade was neither Beatrice nor Benedick. It was Don Pedro who carried out his plan to the letter, and brought the light back to Claudio's face in a twinkling by appearing before him with Leonato and Hero, and saying, "Claudio, when would you like to go to church?" "Tomorrow," was the prompt answer. "Time goes on crutches till I marry Hero. Give her a week, my dear son," said Leonato, and Claudio's heart thumped with joy. "And now," said the amiable Don Pedro, "we must find a wife for Signor Benedick. It is a task for Hercules." "I will help you," said Leonato, "if I have to sit up 10 nights. Then Hero spoke. "I will do what I can, my lord, to find a good husband for Beatrice." Thus, with happy laughter, ended the masquerade which had given Claudio a lesson for nothing. Borachio cheered up Don John by laying a plan before him with which he was confident he could persuade both Claudio and Don Pedro that Hero was a fickle girl who had 2 strings to her bow. Don John agreed to this plan of hate. Don Pedro, on the other hand, had devised a cunning plan of love. "If," he said to Leonato, "we pretend, when Beatrice is near enough to overhear us, that Benedick is pining for her love, she will pity him, see his good qualities, and love him. And if, when Benedick thinks we don't know he is listening, we say how sad it is that the beautiful Beatrice should be in love, with a heartless scoffer like Benedick, he will certainly be on his knees before her in a week or less." So one day, when Benedick was reading in a summer house, Claudio sat down outside it with Leonato and said, "Your daughter told me something about a letter she wrote." "Letter," exclaimed Leonato. "She will get up 20 times in the night and write goodness knows what." But once Hero peeped and saw the words Benedick and Beatrice's on the sheet, and then Beatrice tore it up. "Hero told me," said Claudio, "that she cried, 'Oh, sweet Benedick!'" Benedick was touched to the core by this improbable story, which he was vain enough to believe. "She is fair and good," he said to himself. "I must not seem proud. I feel that I love her. People will laugh, of course, but their paper bullets will do me no harm." At this moment Beatrice came to the summer house and said, "Against my will, I have come to tell you that dinner is ready." "Fair Beatrice, I thank you," said Benedick. "I took no more pains to come than you take pains to come than you take pains to thank me," was the rejoinder, intended to freeze him. But it did not freeze him. It warmed him. The meaning he squeezed out of her rude speech was that she was delighted to come to him. Hero, who had undertaken the task of melting the heart of Beatrice, took no trouble to seek an occasion. She simply said to her maid Margaret one day, "Run into the parlour and whisper to Beatrice that Ursula and I are talking about her in the orchard." Having said this, she felt as sure that Beatrice would overhear what was meant for her ears as if she had made an appointment with her cousin. In the orchard was a bower, screened from the sun by honeysuckles, and Beatrice entered it a few minutes after Margaret had gone on her errand. "But are you sure," asked Ursula, who was one of Hero's attendants, "that Benedict loves Beatrice so devotedly?"
"So say the prince and my betrothed,"
replied Hero, "and they wished me to tell her, but I said, no. Let Benedict get over it." "Why did you say that?" "Because Beatrice is unbearably proud. Her eyes sparkle with disdain and scorn. She is too conceited to love. I should not like to see her making game of poor Benedict's love. I would rather see Benedict waste away like a covered fire." "I don't agree with you," said Ursula. "I think your cousin is too clear-sighted not to see the merits of Benedict."
"He's the one man in Italy, except Claudio," said Hero.
The talkers then left the orchard, and Beatrice, excited and tender, stepped out of the summer-house, saying to herself, "Poor dear Benedict, be true to me, and your love shall tame this wild heart of mine. We now return to the plan of hate." The night before the day fixed for Claudio's wedding, Don John entered a room in which Don Pedro and Claudio were conversing, and asked Claudio if he intended to be married tomorrow.
"You know he does," said Don Pedro.
"He may know differently," said Don John, "when he has seen what I will show him if he will follow me." They followed him into the garden, and they saw a lady leaning out of Hero's window, talking love to Borachio. Claudio thought the lady was Hero and said, "I will shame her for it tomorrow." Don Pedro thought she was Hero too, but she was not Hero too, but she was Margaret. Don John chuckled noiselessly when Claudio and Don Pedro quitted the garden. He gave Borachio a purse containing 1,000 ducats. The money made Borachio feel very gay, and when he was walking in the street with his friend Conrad, he boasted of his wealth and the giver, and told what he had done. A watchman overheard them, and thought that a man who had been paid 1,000 ducats for villainy was worth taking in charge. He therefore arrested Borachio and Conrad, who spent the rest of the night in prison. Before noon of the next day, half the aristocrats in Messina were at church. Hero thought it was her wedding day, and she was there in her wedding dress, no cloud on her pretty face or in her frank and shining eyes. The priest was Friar Francis. Turning to Claudio, he said, "You come hither, my lord, to marry this lady." "No," contradicted Claudio. Leonato thought he was quibbling over grammar. "You should have said, 'Friar,'" said he. "You come to be married to her." Friar Francis turned to Hero. "Lady," he said, "you come hither to be married to this count." "I do," replied Hero. "If either of you know any impediment to this marriage, I charge you to utter it," said the friar. "Do you know of any, Hero?" asked Claudio. "None," said she. "Know you of any, Count?" demanded the friar. "I dare reply for him. None," said Leonato. Claudio exclaimed bitterly, "Oh, what will not men dare say? Father," he continued, "will you give me your daughter?" As freely replied Leonato, as freely replied Leonato, "as God gave her to me." "And what can I give you?" as cliffed Claudio, "which is worthy of this gift?" "Nothing," said Don Pedro, "unless you give the gift back to the giver." "Sweet prince, you teach me," said Claudio. "There, Leonato, take her back." These brutal words were followed by others which flew from Claudio, Don Pedro and Don John. The church seemed no longer sacred. Hero took her own part as long as she could, then she swooned. All her persecutors left the church, except her father, who was befooled by the accusations against her, and cried, "Hence from her! Let her die!" But Friar Francis saw Hero blameless with his clear eyes that probed the soul. "She is innocent," he said. "1,000 signs have told me so." Hero revived under his kind gaze. Her father, flurried and angry, knew not what to think, and the friar said, "They have left her as one dead with shame."
Let us pretend that she is dead until the truth is declared, and slander turns to remorse. The friar advises well, said Benedict.
Then Hero was led away into a retreat, and Beatrice and Benedict remained alone in the church. Benedict knew she had been weeping bitterly and long. "Surely I do believe your fair cousin is wronged," he said. She still wept. "Is it not strange," asked Benedict gently, "that I love nothing in the world as well as you?" "It were as possible for me to say I love nothing as well as you," said Beatrice, "but I do not say it. I'm sorry for my cousin. Tell me what to do for her," said Benedict. "Kill Claudio." "Ha! Not for the wide world," said Benedict. "Your refusal kills me," said Beatrice. "Farewell." "Enough! I will challenge him," cried Benedict. During this scene, Borachio and Conrad were in prison. There they were examined by a constable called Dogberry. The watchman gave evidence to the effect that Borachio had said that he had received 1,000 ducats for conspiring against Hero. Leonato was not present at this examination, but he was nevertheless now thoroughly convinced of Hero's innocence. He played the part of bereaved father very well, and when Don Pedro and Claudio called on him in a friendly way, he said to the Italian, "You have slandered my child to death, and I challenge you to combat." "I cannot fight an old man," said Claudio. "You could kill a girl," sneered Leonato, and Claudio crimsoned. Hot words grew from hot words, and both Don Pedro and Claudio were feeling scorched when Leonato left the room and Benedict entered. The old man said Claudio was like to have snapped my nose off. "You are a villain," said Benedict shortly. "Fight me when and with what weapon you please, or I call you a coward." Claudio was astounded, but said, "I'll meet you. Nobody shall say I can't carve a calf's head." Benedict smiled, and as it was time for Don Pedro to receive officials, the prince sat down in a chair of state and prepared his mind for justice. The door soon opened to admit Dogberry and his prisoners. "What offence?" said Don Pedro. "Are these men charged with?" Borachio thought the moment a happy one for making a clean breast of it. He laid the whole blame on Don John, who had disappeared. The Lady Hero being dead, he said, "I desire nothing but the reward of a murderer." Claudio heard with anguish and deep repentance. Upon the re-entrance of Leonato, he said to him, "This slave makes clear your daughter's innocence. Choose your revenge." "Leonato," said Don Pedro humbly, "I am ready for any penance you may impose. I ask you both," then said Leonato, "to proclaim my daughter's innocence and to honor her tomb by singing her praise before it. As for you, Claudio, I have this to say. My brother has a daughter so like Hero that she might be a copy of her. Marry her, and my vengeful feelings die." "Noble sir," said Claudio, "I am yours." Claudio then went to his room and composed a solemn song. Going to the church with Don Pedro and his attendants, he sang it before the monument of Leonato's family. When he had ended, he said, "Good night," he said, "good night. Oh, yearly will I do this." He then gravely, as became a gentleman whose heart was Hero's, made ready to marry a girl whom he did not love. He was told to meet her in Leonato's house and was faithful to his appointment. He was shown into a room where Antonio, Leonato's brother, and several masked ladies entered after him. Friar Francis, Leonato, and Benedict were present. Antonio led one of the ladies towards Claudio. "Sweet," said the young man, "let me see your face." "Swear first to marry her," said Leonato. "Give me your hand," said Claudio to the lady. "Before this holy friar I swear to marry you if you will be my wife." "Alive I was your wife," said the lady, as she drew off her mask. "Another Hero!" exclaimed Claudio. "Hero died," explained Leonato, "only while slander lived." The friar was then going to marry the reconciled pair, but Benedict interrupted him with, "Softly, friar, which of these ladies is Beatrice?" "Moderately," answered Benedict. "I was told you were well nigh dead for me," remarked Beatrice. "Of you I was told the same," said Benedick. "Here's your own hand in evidence of your love," said Claudio, producing a feeble sonnet which Benedick had written to his sweetheart. "And here," said Hero, "is a tribute to Benedick, which I picked out of the pocket of Beatrice." "A miracle!" exclaimed Benedick. "Our hands are against our hearts. Come, I will marry you, Beatrice." "You shall be my husband to save your life," was the rejoinder. Benedick kissed her on the mouth, and the friar married them after he had married Claudio and Hero. "How is Benedick the married man?" asked Don Pedro. "Too happy to be made unhappy," replied Benedick. "Crack what jokes you will. As for you, Claudio, I had hoped to run you through the body, but as you are now my kinsman, live whole and love my cousin." "My cudgel was in love with you, Benedick, until today," said Claudio. "But come, come, let's dance," said Benedick. And dance they did. Not even the news of the capture of Don John was able to stop the flying feet of the happy lovers, for revenge is not sweet against an evil man who has failed to do harm. Romeo and Juliet. Once upon a time there lived in Verona 2 great families named Montague and Capulet. They were both rich, and I suppose they were as sensible in most things as other rich people. But in one thing they were extremely silly. There was an old quarrel between the 2 families, and instead of making it up like reasonable folks, they made a sort of pet of their quarrel, and would not let it die out. So that a Montague wouldn't speak to a Capulet if he met one in the street, nor a Capulet to a Montague, or if they did speak, it was to say rude and unpleasant things, which often ended in a fight. And their relations and servants were just as foolish, so that street fights and duels and uncomfortablenesses of that kind were always growing out of the Montague and Capulet quarrel. Now Lord Capulet, the head of that family, gave a party a grand supper and a dance, and he was so hospitable that he said anyone might come to it except, of course, the Montagues. But there was a young Montague named Romeo, who very much wanted to be there, because Rosaline, the lady he loved, had been asked. This lady had never been at all kind to him, and he had no reason to love her. But the fact was that he wanted to love somebody, and as he hadn't seen the right lady, he was obliged to love the wrong one. So to the Capulets' grand party he came with his friends Mercutio and Benvolio. Old Capulet welcomed him and his 2 friends very kindly, and young Romeo moved about among the crowd of courtly folk dressed in their velvets and satins, the men with jewelled sword hilts and collars, and the ladies with brilliant gems on breast and arms, and stones of price set in their bright girdles. Romeo was in his best too, and though he wore a black mask over his eyes and nose, everyone could see by his mouth and his hair, and the way he held his head, that he was 12 times handsomer than anyone else in the room. Presently, amid the dancers, he saw a lady so beautiful and so lovable that from that moment he never again gave one thought to that Rosaline, whom he had thought he loved. And he looked at this other fair lady as she moved in the dance in her white satin and pearls, and all the world seemed vain and worthless to him compared with her. And he was saying this or something like it, when Tybalt, Lady Capulet's nephew, hearing his voice, knew him to be Romeo. Tybalt, being very angry, went at once to his uncle and told him how Montague had come uninvited to the feast. But old Capulet was too fine a gentleman to be discourteous to any man under his own roof, and he bade Tybalt be quiet. But this young man only waited for a chance to quarrel with Romeo. In the meantime, Romeo made his way to the fair lady and told her in sweet words that he loved her and kissed her. Just then her mother sent for her, and then Romeo found out that the lady on whom he had set his heart's hopes was Juliet, the daughter of Lord Capulet, his sworn foe. So he went away, sorrowing indeed, but loving her none the less. Then Juliet said to her nurse, "Who is that gentleman that would not dance?" "His name is Romeo, and a Montague, the only son of your great enemy," answered the nurse. Then Juliet went to her room and looked out of her window over the beautiful green-grey garden where the moon was shining. And Romeo was hidden in that garden among the trees because he could not bear to go right away without trying to see her again. So she, not knowing him to be there, spoke her secret thought aloud and told the quiet garden how she loved Romeo. And Romeo heard and was glad beyond measure. Hidden below, he looked up and saw her fair face in the moonlight, framed in the blossoming creepers that grew round her window, and as he looked and listened, he felt as though he had been carried away in a dream, and set down by some magician in that beautiful and enchanted garden. "Ah, why are you called Romeo?" said Juliet. "Since I love you, what does it matter what you are called? Call me but Love, and I'll be new baptized henceforth. I never will be Romeo," he cried, stepping into the full white moonlight from the shade of the cypresses and oleanders that had hidden him. She was frightened at first, but when she saw that it was Romeo himself and no stranger, she too was glad. And, he standing in the garden below, and she leaning from the window, they spoke long together, each one trying to find the sweetest words in the world to make that pleasant talk that lovers use. And the tale of all they said, and the sweet music their voices made together, is all set down in a golden book, where you children may read it for yourselves some day. And the time passed so quickly, as it does for folk who love each other and are together, that when the time came to part, it seemed as though they had met but that moment, and indeed they hardly knew how to part. "I will send to you tomorrow," said Juliet. And so at last, with lingering and longing, they said goodbye. Juliet went into her room, and a dark curtain hid her bright window. Romeo went away through the still and dewy garden, like a man in a dream. The next morning, very early, Romeo went to Friar Laurence, a priest, and, telling him all the story, begged him to marry him to Juliet without delay. And this, after some talk, the priest consented to do. So when Juliet sent her old nurse to Romeo that day to know what he purposed to do, the old woman took back a message that all was well and all things ready for the marriage of Juliet and Romeo on the next morning. The young lovers were afraid to ask their parents' consent to their marriage, as young people should do because of this foolish old quarrel between the Capulets and the Montagues. And Friar Laurence was willing to help the young lovers secretly because he thought that when they were once married their parents might soon be told, and that the match might put a happy end to the old quarrel. So the next morning early, Romeo and Juliet were married at Friar Laurence's cell, and parted with tears and kisses. And Romeo promised to come into the garden that evening, and the nurse got ready a rope ladder to let down from the window, so that Romeo could climb up and talk to his dear wife quietly and alone. But that very day a dreadful thing happened. Tybalt, the young man who had been so vexed at Romeo's going to the Capulets' feast, met him and his two friends, Mercutio and Benvolio, in the street, called Romeo a villain, and asked him to fight. Romeo had no wish to fight with Juliet's cousin, but Mercutio drew his sword and he and Tybalt fought. And Mercutio was killed. When Romeo saw that this friend was dead, he forgot everything except anger at the man who had killed him, and he and Tybalt fought till Tybalt fell dead. So, on the very day of his wedding, Romeo killed his dear Juliet's cousin and was sentenced to be banished. Poor Juliet and her young husband met that night indeed. He climbed the rope ladder among the flowers and found her window, but their meeting was a sad one, and they parted with bitter tears and hearts heavy, because they could not know when they should meet again. Now Juliet's father, who, of course, had no idea that she was married, wished her to wed a gentleman named Paris, and was so angry when she refused that she hurried away to ask Friar Laurence what she should do. He advised her to pretend to consent, and then he said, "I will give you a draught that will make you seem to be dead for 2 days, and then when they take you to church, it will be to bury you, and not to marry you. They will put you in the vault, thinking you are dead, and before you wake up, ROMEO, and I will be there to take care of you. Will you do this, or are you afraid? I will do it." "Talk not to me of fear," said Juliet, and she went home and told her father she would marry Paris, if she had spoken out and told her father the truth. Well, then this would have been a different story. Lord Capulet was very much pleased to get his own way, and set about inviting his friends and getting the wedding feast ready. Everyone stayed up all night, for there was a great deal to do, and very little time to do it in. Lord Capulet was anxious to get Juliet married because he saw she was very unhappy. Of course she was really fretting about her husband Romeo, but her father thought she was grieving for the death of her cousin Tybalt, and he thought marriage would give her something else to think about. Early in the morning, the nurse came to call Juliet and to dress her for her wedding. But she would not wake, and at last the nurse cried out suddenly, "Alas! Alas! Help, help! My lady's dead! Oh, well a day that ever I was born!" Lady Capulet came running in, and then Lord Capulet and Lord Paris, the bridegroom. There lay Juliet cold and white and lifeless, and all their weeping could not wake her. So it was a burying that day instead of a marrying that day instead of a marrying. Meantime, Friar Laurence had sent a messenger to Mantua with a letter to Romeo, telling him of all these things. And all would have been well, only the messenger was delayed, and could not go, but ill news travels fast. Romeo's servant, who knew the secret of the marriage, but not of Juliet's pretended death, heard of her funeral, and hurried to Mantua to tell Romeo how his young wife was dead and lying in the grave. "Is it so?" cried Romeo, heartbroken. "Then I will lie by Juliet's side tonight," and he bought himself a poison and went straight back to Verona. He hastened to the tomb where Juliet was lying. It was not a grave, but a vault. He broke open the door, and was just going down the stone steps that led to the vault where all the dead Capulets lay, when he heard a voice behind him calling on him to stop. It was the Count Paris, who was to have married Juliet that very day. "How dare you come here and disturb the dead bodies of the Capulets, you vile Montague?" cried Paris. Poor Romeo, half mad with sorrow, yet tried to answer gently. "You were told," said Paris, "that if you returned to Verona you must die." "I must indeed," said Romeo. "I came here for nothing else." "Good, gentle youth, leave me." "Oh, go before I do you any harm." "I love you better than myself, go leave me here." Then Paris said, "I defy you, and I arrest you as a felon." And Romeo, in his anger and despair, drew his sword. They fought, and Paris was killed. As Romeo's sword pierced him, Paris cried, "Oh, I am slain. If thou be merciful, open the tomb, and lay me with Juliet." And Romeo said, "In faith I will." And he carried the dead man into the tomb and laid him by the dear Juliet's side. Then he kneeled by Juliet and spoke to her, and held her in his arms, and kissed her cold lips, believing that she was dead, while all the while she was coming nearer and nearer to the time of her awakening. Then he drank the poison and died beside his sweetheart and wife. Now came Friar Lawrence when it was too late, and saw all that had happened, and then poor Juliet woke out of her sleep to find her husband and her friend both dead beside her. The noise of the fight had brought other folks to the place too, and Friar Lawrence, hearing them, ran away, and Juliet was left alone. She saw the cup that had held the poison, and knew how all had happened, and since no poison was left for her, she drew her Romeo's dagger and thrust it through her heart, and so, falling with her head on her Romeo's breast, she died. And here ends the story of these faithful and most unhappy lovers. SEIEGYU. And when the old folks knew from Friar Lawrence of all that had befallen, They sorrowed exceedingly, and now, seeing all the mischief their wicked quarrel had wrought, they repented them of it, and over the bodies of their dead children they clasped hands at last in friendship and forgiveness. Pericles. Pericles, the Prince of Tyre, was unfortunate enough to make an enemy of Antiochus, the powerful and wicked king of Antioch. And so great was the danger in which he stood that, on the advice of his trusty counsellor, Lord Helicanus, he determined to travel about the world for a time. He came to this decision despite the fact that by the death of his father he was now king of Tyre. So he set sail for Tarsus, appointing Helicanus regent during his absence. That he did wisely in thus leaving his kingdom was soon made clear. Hardly had he sailed on his voyage when Lord Thaliard arrived from Antioch with instructions from his royal master to kill Pericles. The faithful Helicanus soon discovered the deadly purpose of this wicked lord, and at once sent messengers to Tarsus to warn the king of the danger which threatened him. The people of Tarsus were in such poverty and distress that Pericles, feeling that he could find no safe refuge there, put to sea again. But a dreadful storm overtook the ship in which he was, and the good vessel was wrecked, while of all on board only Pericles was saved. Bruised and wet and faint, he was flung upon the cruel rocks on the coast of Pentapolis, the country of the good king Simonides. Worn out as he was, he looked for nothing but death, and that speedily. But some fishermen, coming down to the beach, found him there, and gave him clothes and bade him be of good cheer. "Thou shalt come home with me," said one of them, "and we will have flesh for holidays, fish for fasting days, and murra puddings and flapjacks, and thou shalt be welcome." They told him that on the morrow many princes and knights were going to the king's court, there to joust and tourney for the love of his daughter, the beautiful Princess Thaisa. "Did but my fortunes equal my desires," said Pericles, "I'd wish to make one there." As he spoke, some of the fishermen came by, drawing their net, and it dragged heavily, resisting all their efforts, but at last they hauled it in to find that it contained a suit of rusty armour, and looking at it, he blessed fortune for her kindness, for he saw that it was his own, which had been given to him by his dead father. He begged the fisherman to let him have it that he might go to court and take part in the tournament, promising that if ever his ill fortunes bettered, he would reward them well. The fisherman readily consented, and being thus fully equipped, Pericles set off in his rusty armour to the king's court. In the tournament none bore himself so well as Pericles, and he won the wreath of victory, which the fair princess herself placed on his brows. Then, at her father's command, she asked him who he was and whence he came, and he answered that he was a knight of Tyre, by name Pericles, but he did not tell her that he was the king of that country, for he knew that if once his whereabouts became known to Antiochus, his life would not be worth a pin's purchase. Nevertheless, Thaisa loved him dearly, and the king was so pleased with his courage and graceful bearing that he gladly permitted his daughter to have her own way when she told him she would marry the stranger knight or die. Thus Pericles became the husband of the fair lady for whose sake he had striven with the knights who came in all their bravery to joust and tourney for her love. Meanwhile the wicked king Antiochus had died, and the people in Tyre, hearing no news of their king, urged Lord Helicanus to ascend the vacant throne. But they could only get him to promise that he would become their king. If at the end of a year Pericles did not come back. Moreover, he sent forth messengers far and wide in search of the missing Pericles. Some of these made their way to Pentapolis, and finding their king there, told him how discontented his people were at his long absence, and that, Antiochus being dead, there was nothing now to hinder him from returning to his kingdom. Then Pericles told his wife and father-in-law who he really was, and they and all the subjects of Simonides greatly rejoiced to know that the gallant husband of Thaisa was a king in his own right. So Pericles set sail with his dear wife for his native land. But once more the sea was cruel to him. For again a dreadful storm broke out, and while it was at its height, a servant came to tell him that a little daughter was born to him. This news would have made his heart glad indeed, but that the servant went on to add that his wife, his dear, dear Thaisa, was dead. While he was praying the gods to be good to his little baby girl, the sailors came to him declaring that the dead queen must be thrown overboard, for they believed that the storm would never cease so long as a dead body remained in the vessel. So Thaisa was laid in a big chest with spices and jewels, and a scroll on which the sorrowful king wrote these lines. Here I give to understand, if e'er this coffin drive a land, I, King Pericles, have lost this queen worth all our mundane cost. Who finds her, give her burying. She was the daughter of a king. Besides this treasure for a fee, the gods requite his charity.
Then the chest was cast into the sea, and the waves taking it, by and by washed it ashore at Ephesus, where it was found by the servants of a lord named Cerimon.
He at once ordered it to be opened, and when he saw how lovely Thaisa looked, he doubted if she were dead, and took immediate steps to restore her. Then a great wonder happened, for she, who had been thrown into the sea as dead, came back to life. But feeling sure that she would never see her husband again, Thaisa retired from the world and became a priestess of the goddess Diana. While these things were happening, Pericles went on to Tarsus with his little daughter, whom he called Marina, because she had been born at sea. Leaving her in the hands of his old friend, the governor of Tarsus, the king sailed for his own dominions. Now Dionysa, the wife of the governor of Tarsus, was a jealous and wicked woman, and finding that the young princess grew up a more accomplished and charming girl than her own daughter, she determined to take Marina's life. So when Marina was 14, Dionysa ordered one of her servants to take her away and kill her. This villain would have done so, but that he was interrupted by some pirates who came in and carried Marina off to sea with them, and took her to Mytilene, where they sold her as a slave. Yet such was her goodness, her grace, and her beauty, that she soon became honoured there, and Lysimachus, the young governor, fell deep in love with her, and would have married her, but that he thought she must be of too humble parentage to become the wife of one in his high position. The wicked Dionysa believed, from her servant's report, that Marina was really dead, and so she put up a monument to her memory, and showed it to King Pericles, when after long years of absence he came to see his much-loved child. When he heard that she was dead, his grief was terrible to see. He set sail once more, and putting on sackcloth, vowed never to wash his face or cut his hair again. There was a pavilion erected on deck, and there he lay alone, and for 3 months he spoke word to none. At last it chanced that his ship came into the port of Mytilene, and Lysimachus, the governor, went on board to inquire whence the vessel came. When he heard the story of Pericles' sorrow and silence, he bethought him of Marina, and believing that she could rouse the king from his stupor, sent for her and bade her try her utmost to persuade the king to speak, promising whatever reward she would, if she succeeded. Marina gladly obeyed, and sending the rest away, she sat and sang to her poor grief-laden father, yet sweet as was her voice, he made no sign. So presently she spoke to him, saying that her grief might equal his. For though Hamlet was the only son of the King of Denmark, he loved his father and mother dearly, and was happy in the love of a sweet lady named Ophelia. Her father, Polonius, was the king's chamberlain. While Hamlet was away studying at Wittenberg, his father died. Young Hamlet hastened home in great grief to hear that a serpent had stung the king, and that he was dead. The young prince had loved his father so tenderly that you may judge what he felt when he found that the queen, before yet the king had been laid in the ground a month, had determined to marry again, and to marry the dead king's brother. Hamlet refused to put off mourning for the wedding. "It is not only the black I wear on my body," he said, "that proves my loss. I wear mourning in my heart for my dead father. His son at least remembers him, and grieves still." Then said Claudius, the king's brother, "This grief is unreasonable. Of course you must sorrow at the loss of your father, but—" "Ah!" said Hamlet bitterly, "I cannot in one little month forget those I love." With that, the Queen and Claudius left him to make merry over their wedding, forgetting the poor good king who had been so kind to them both. And Hamlet, left alone, began to wonder and to question as to what he ought to do, for he could not believe the story about the snake bite. It seemed to him all too plain that the wicked Claudius had killed the king so as to get the crown and marry the queen, yet he had no proof and could not accuse Claudius. And while he was thus thinking came Horatio, a fellow student of his, from Wittenberg. "What brought you here?" asked Hamlet, when he had greeted his friend kindly. "I came, my lord, to see your father's funeral." "I think it was to see my mother's wedding," said Hamlet bitterly. "My father! We shall not look upon his like again." "My lord," answered Horatio, "I think I saw him yesternight." Then, while Hamlet listened in surprise, Horatio told how he, with 2 gentlemen of the guard, had seen the king's ghost on the battlement. Cymbeline. Cymbeline was the king of Britain. He had 3 children. The 2 sons were stolen away from him when they were quite little children, and he was left with only 1 daughter, Imogen. The king married a second time and brought up Leonatus, the son of a dear friend, as Imogen's playfellow. And when Leonatus was old enough, Imogen secretly married him. This made the king and queen very angry, and the king, to punish Leonatus, banished him from Britain. Poor Imogen was nearly heartbroken at parting from Leonatus, and he was not less unhappy, for they were not only lovers and husband and wife, but they had been friends and comrades, Macbeth. When a person is asked to tell the story of Macbeth, he can tell 2 stories. One is of a man called Macbeth who came to the throne of Scotland by a crime in the year of our Lord 1039, and reigned justly and well, on the whole, for 15 years or more. This story is part of Scottish history. The other story issues from a place called Imagination. It is gloomy and wonderful, and you shall hear it. The Comedy of Errors. Aegeon was a merchant of Syracuse, which is a seaport in Sicily. His wife was Amelia, and they were very happy until Aegeon's manager died, and he was obliged to go by himself to a place called Epidamnum on the Adriatic. As soon as she could, Amelia followed him, and after that the merchant of Venice. Antonio was a rich and prosperous merchant of Venice. His ships were on nearly every sea, and he traded with Portugal, with Mexico, with England, and with India. Although proud of his riches, he was very generous with them, and delighted to use them in relief. Timon of Athens. 400 years before the birth of Christ, a man lived in Athens whose generosity was not only great, but absurd. He was very rich, but no worldly wealth was enough for a man who spent and gave like Timon. If anybody gave Timon a horse, he received from Timon 20 better horses. Othello. 400 years ago there lived in Venice an ensign named Iago, who hated his general Othello for not making him a lieutenant. Instead of Iago, who was strongly recommended, Othello had chosen Michael Cassio, whose smooth tongue had helped him to win the heart of Desdemona. Iago had a friend called Rodrigo, who supplied him with money, the taming of the shrew. The eldest, Catherine, was so very cross and ill-tempered and unmannerly that no one ever dreamed of marrying her, while her sister, Bianca, was so sweet and pretty and pleasant-spoken, measure for measure. More centuries ago than I care to say, the people of Vienna were governed too mildly. The reason was that the reigning Duke Vicentio was excessively good-natured and disliked to see offenders made unhappy. The consequence was that the number of ill-behaved persons in Vienna was enough. 2 gentlemen of Verona. Only one of them was really a gentleman, as you will discover later. Their names were Valentine and Proteus. They were friends and lived at Verona, a town in northern Italy. Valentine was happy in his name because it was that of the patron saint of lovers. It is hard for a Valentine to be fickle or mean. Proteus was unhappy in his name because it was that of a famous shape-changer, and therefore it encouraged him to be a lover at one time and a traitor at another. One day, Valentine told his friend that he was going to Milan. "I'm not in love like you," said he, "and therefore I don't want to stay at home." Proteus was in love with a beautiful, yellow-haired girl called Julia, who was rich and had no one to order her about. He was, however, sorry to part from Valentine, and he said, "If ever you are in danger, tell me, and I will pray for you." Valentine then went to Milan with a servant called Speed, and at Milan he fell in love with the Duke of Milan's daughter, Silvia. When Proteus and Valentine parted, Julia had not acknowledged that she loved Proteus. Indeed, she had actually torn up one of his letters in the presence of her maid, Lucetta. Lucetta, however, was no simpleton, for when she saw the pieces she said to herself, "All she wants is to be annoyed by another letter." Indeed, no sooner had Lucetta left her alone than Julia repented of her tearing, and placed between her dress and her heart the torn piece of paper on which Proteus had signed his name. So by tearing a letter written by Proteus, she discovered that she loved him. Then, like a brave, sweet girl, she wrote to Proteus, "Be patient, and you shall marry me." Delighted with these words, Proteus walked about, flourishing Julia's letter and talking to himself. "What have you got there?" asked his father, Antonio. "A letter from Valentine," fibbed Proteus. "Let me read it," said Antonio. "There is no news," said deceitful Proteus. "He only says that he is very happy, and the Duke of Milan is kind to him, and that he wishes I were with him." This fib had the effect of making Antonio think that his son should go to Milan and enjoy the favours in which Valentine basked. "You must go tomorrow," he decreed. Proteus was dismayed. "Give me time to get my outfit ready." He was met with the promise, "What you need shall be sent after you." It grieved Julia to part from her lover before their engagement was 2 days old. She gave him a ring and said, "Keep this for my sake," and he gave her a ring, and they kissed like two who intend to be true till death. Then Proteus departed for Milan. Meanwhile, Valentine was amusing Silvia, whose grey eyes, laughing at him under auburn hair, had drowned him in love. One day she told him that she wanted to write a pretty letter to a gentleman whom she thought well of, but had no time. Would he write it? Very much did Valentine dislike writing that letter, but he did write it, and gave it to her coldly. "Take it back," she said. "You did it unwillingly, madam," he said. "It was difficult to write such a letter for you." "Take it back," she commanded. "You did not write tenderly enough." Valentine was left with the letter, and condemned to write another. But his servant Speed saw that, in effect, the Lady Silvia had allowed Valentine to write for her a love letter to Valentine's own self. "The joke," he said, "is as invisible as a weathercock on a steeple." He meant that it was very plain, and he went on to say exactly what it was. If master will write her love letters, he must answer them. On the arrival of Proteus, he was introduced by Valentine to Silvia and afterwards. When they were alone, Valentine asked Proteus how his love for Julia was prospering. "Why," said Proteus, "you used to get worried when I spoke of her," confessed Valentine. "But it's different now. I can eat and drink all day with nothing but love on my plate and love in my cup. You idolize Sylvia, said Proteus. She is divine, said Valentine. Come, come, remonstrated Proteus. Well, if she's not divine, said Valentine, she is the queen of all women on earth, except Julia, said Proteus. Dear boy, said Valentine, Julia is not accepted, but I will grant that she alone is worthy to bear my lady's train. Your bragging astounds me, said Proteus. But he had seen Sylvia, and he felt suddenly that the yellow-haired Julia was black in comparison. He became in thought a villain without delay, and said to himself what he had never said before: I, to myself, am dearer than my friend. It would have been convenient for Valentine if Proteus had changed, by the power of the god whose name he bore, the shape of his body at the evil moment when he despised Julia, in admiring Sylvia. But his body did not change. His smile was still affectionate, and Valentine confided to him the great secret that Sylvia had now promised to run away with him. In the pocket of this cloak, said Valentine, I have a silken rope ladder with hooks which will clasp the window bar of her room. Proteus knew the reason why Sylvia and her lover were bent on flight. The Duke intended her to wed Sir Thurio, a gentlemanly noodle for whom she did not care a straw. Proteus thought that if he could get rid of Valentine, he might make Sylvia fond of him, especially if the Duke insisted on her enduring Sir Thurio's tiresome chatter. He therefore went to the Duke and said, Duty before friendship. It grieves me to thwart my friend Valentine, but your Grace should know that he intends tonight to elope with your Grace's daughter. He begged the Duke not to tell Valentine the giver of this information, and the Duke assured him that his name would not be divulged. Early that evening the Duke summoned Valentine, who came to him wearing a large cloak with a bulging pocket. You know, said the Duke, my desire to marry my daughter to Sir Thurio. I do, replied Valentine. He is virtuous and generous as befits a man so honoured in your Grace's thoughts. Nevertheless she dislikes him, said the Duke. She is a peevish, proud, disobedient girl, and I should be sorry to leave her a penny. I intend, therefore, to marry again. Valentine bowed. I hardly know how the young people of today make love, continued the Duke, and I thought that you would be just the man to teach me how to win the lady of my choice. Jewels have been known to plead rather well, said Valentine. I have tried them, said the Duke. The habit of liking the giver may grow if your Grace gives her some more. The chief difficulty, pursued the Duke, is this. The lady is promised to a young gentleman, and it is hard to have a word with her. She is, in fact, locked up. Then your Grace should propose an elopement, said Valentine. Try a rope ladder. But how should I carry it? Asked the Duke. A rope ladder is light, said Valentine. You can carry it in a cloak. Like yours. Yes, your Grace. Then yours will do. Kindly lend it to me. Valentine had talked himself into a trap. He could not refuse to lend his cloak, and when the Duke had donned it, his Grace drew from the pocket a sealed missive addressed to Sylvia. He coolly opened it and read these words, Sylvia, you shall be free tonight. Indeed, he said, and here's the rope ladder. Prettily contrived, but not perfectly. I give you, sir, a day to leave my dominions. If you are in Milan by this time tomorrow, you die. Poor Valentine was saddened to the core. Unless I look on Sylvia in the day, he said, there is no day for me to look upon. Before he went, he took farewell of Proteus, who proved a hypocrite of the first order. Hope is a lover's staff, said Valentine's betrayer. Walk hence with that. After leaving Milan, Valentine and his servant wandered into a forest near Mantua, where the great poet Virgil lived. In the forest, however, the poets, if any, were brigands who bade the travellers stand. They obeyed, and Valentine made so good an impression upon his captors that they offered him his life on condition that he became their captain. "I accept," said Valentine, "provided you release my servant, and are not violent to women or the poor." The reply was worthy of Virgil, and Valentine became a brigand chief. We return now to Julia, who found Verona too dull to live in since Proteus had gone. She begged her maid Lucetta to devise a way by which she could see him. "Better wait for him to return," said Lucetta, and she talked so sensibly that Julia saw it was idle to hope that Lucetta would bear the blame of any rash and interesting adventure. Julia therefore said that she intended to go to Milan and dressed like a page. "You must cut off your hair then," said Lucetta, who thought that at this announcement Julia would immediately abandon her scheme. "I shall knot it up," was the disappointing rejoinder. Lucetta then tried to make the scheme seem foolish to Julia, but Julia had made up her mind and was not to be put off by ridicule. And when her toilet was completed, she looked as comely a page as one could wish to see. Julia assumed the male name Sebastian, and arrived in Milan in time to hear music being performed outside the Duke's palace. "They are serenading the Lady Sylvia," said a man to her. Suddenly she heard a voice lifted in song, and she knew that voice. It was the voice of Proteus. But what was he singing? "Who is Sylvia? What is she? That all our swains commend her. Holy fair and wise is she. The heavens such grace did lend her that she might admired be." Julia tried not to hear the rest, but these two lines somehow thundered into her mind. "Then to Sylvia let us sing, she excels each mortal thing." Then Proteus thought Sylvia excelled Julia, and since he sang so beautifully for all the world to hear, it seemed that he was not only false to Julia, but had forgotten her. Yet Julia still loved him. She even went to him and asked to be his page, and Proteus engaged her. One day he handed to her the ring which she had given him, and said, "Sebastian, take that to the Lady Sylvia, and say that I should like the picture of her she promised me." Sylvia had promised the picture, but she disliked Proteus. She was obliged to talk to him because he was high in the favour of her father, who thought he pleaded with her on behalf of Sir Thurio. Sylvia had learned from Valentine that Proteus was pledged to a sweetheart in Verona, and when he said tender things to her, she felt that he was disloyal in friendship as well as love. Julia bore the ring to Sylvia, but Sylvia said, "I will not wrong the woman who gave it him by wearing it." "She thanks you," said Julia. "You know her then," said Sylvia, and Julia spoke so tenderly of herself that Sylvia wished that Sebastian would marry Julia. Sylvia gave Julia her portrait for Proteus, who would have received it the worse for extra touches on the nose and eyes if Julia had not made up her mind that she was as pretty as Sylvia. Soon there was an uproar in the palace. Sylvia had fled. The Duke was certain that her intention was to join the exiled Valentine, and he was not wrong. Without delay, he started in pursuit, with Sir Thurio, Proteus, and some servants. The members of the pursuing party got separated, and Proteus and Julia, in her page's dress, were by themselves when they saw Sylvia, who had been taken prisoner by outlaws and was now being led to their captain. Proteus rescued her, and then said, "I have saved you from death. Give me one kind look." "Oh, misery, to be helped by you," cried Sylvia. "I would rather be a lion's breakfast." Julia was silent, but cheerful. Proteus was so much annoyed with Sylvia that he threatened her and seized her by the waist. "Oh, heaven!" cried Sylvia. At that instant there was a noise of crackling branches. Valentine came crashing through the Mantuan forest to the rescue of his beloved. Julia feared he would slay Proteus and hurried to help her false lover. But he struck no blow. He only said, "Proteus, I am sorry, I must never trust you more." Thereat Proteus felt his guilt, and fell on his knees, saying, "Forgive me, I grieve, I suffer. Then you are my friend once more," said the generous Valentine. "If Sylvia that is lost to me will look on you with favour, I promise that I will stand aside and bless you both." These words were terrible to Julia, and she swooned. Valentine revived her and said, "What was the matter, boy?" I remembered. Fibbed Julia, "That I was charged to give a ring to the Lady Sylvia, and that I did not." "Well, give it to me," said Proteus. She handed him a ring, but it was the ring that Proteus gave to Julia before he left Verona. Proteus looked at her hand and crimsoned to the roots of his hair. "I changed my shape when you changed your mind," said she. "But I love you again," said he. Just then outlaws entered, bringing 2 prizes, the Duke and Sir Thurio. "Forbear!" cried Valentine sternly. "The Duke is sacred," Sir Thurio exclaimed. "There's Sylvia. She's mine. Touch her, and you die," said Valentine. "I should be a fool to risk anything for her," said Sir Thurio. "Then you are base," said the Duke. "Valentine, you are a brave man. Your banishment is over. I recall you. You may marry Sylvia. You deserve her." "I thank your grace," said Valentine, deeply moved, "and yet must ask you one more boon." "I grant it," said the Duke. "Pardon these men, your grace, and give them employment. They are better than their calling." "I pardon them and you," said the Duke. "Their work henceforth shall be for wages. What think you of this page, your grace?" asked Valentine, indicating Julia. The Duke glanced at her and said, "I think the boy has grace in him." "More grace than boy, say I," laughed Valentine, and the only punishment which Proteus had to bear for his treacheries against love and friendship was the recital in his presence of the adventures of Julius Sebastian of Verona. All's well that ends well. In the year 1300 and something, the Countess of Roussillon was unhappy in her palace near the Pyrenees. She had lost her husband, and the King of France had summoned her son Bertram to Paris, hundreds of miles away. Bertram was a pretty youth with curling hair, finely arched eyebrows, and eyes as keen as a hawk's. He was as proud as ignorance could make him, and would lie with a face like truth itself to gain a selfish end. But a pretty youth is a pretty youth, and Helena was in love with him. Helena was the daughter of a great doctor who had died in the service of the Count of Roussillon. Her sole fortune consisted in a few of her father's prescriptions. When Bertram had gone, Helena's forlorn look was noticed by the Countess, who told her that she was exactly the same to her as her own child. Tears then gathered in Helena's eyes, for she felt that the Countess made Bertram seem like a brother whom she could never marry. The Countess guessed her secret forthwith, and Helena confessed that Bertram was to her as the sun is to the day. She hoped, however, to win this son by earning the gratitude of the King of France, who suffered from a lingering illness, which made him lame. The great doctors attached to the court despaired of curing him, but Helena had confidence in a prescription which her father had used with success. Taking an affectionate leave of the Countess, she went to Paris, and was allowed to see the king. He was very polite, but it was plain he thought her a quack. "It would not become me," he said, "to apply to a simple maiden for the relief which all the learned doctors cannot give me." "Heaven uses weak instruments sometimes," said Helena, and she declared that she would forfeit her life if she failed to make him well. "And if you succeed?" questioned the king. "Then I will ask your majesty to give me for a husband the man whom I choose. So earnest a young lady could not be resisted forever by a suffering king." Helena, therefore, became the king's doctor, and in 2 days the royal cripple could skip. He summoned his courtiers, and they made a glittering throng in the throne room of his palace. Well might the country girl have been dazzled and seen a dozen husbands worth dreaming of among the handsome young noblemen before her, but her eyes only wandered till they found Bertram. Then she went up to him and said, "I dare not say I take you, but I am yours." Raising her voice that the king might hear, she added, "This is the man." "Bertram," said the king. "Take her. She's your wife, my liege," said Bertram. "I beg your majesty to permit me to choose a wife." "Do you know, Bertram, what she has done for your king?" asked the monarch, who had treated Bertram like a son. "Yes, your majesty," replied Bertram. "But why should I marry a girl who owes her breeding to my father's charity? You disdain her for lacking a title, but I can give her a title." "But I can give her a title," said the king. And as he looked at the sulky youth, a thought came to him, and he added, "Strange that you think so much of blood when you could not distinguish your own from a beggar's if you saw them mixed together in a bowl." "I cannot love her," asserted Bertram. And Helena said gently, "Urge him not, your majesty. I am glad to have cured my king for my country's sake." "My honour requires that scornful boy's obedience," said the king. "Bertram, make up your mind to this. You marry this lady of whom you are so unworthy, or you learn how a king can hate. Your answer." Bertram bowed low and said, "Your majesty has ennobled the lady by your interest in her. I submit." "Take her by the band," said the king, "and tell her she is yours." Bertram obeyed, and with little delay he was married to Helena. Fear of the king, however, could not make him a lover. Ridicule helped to sour him. A base soldier named Pericles told him to his face that now he had a kicky-wicky. His business was not to fight, but to stay at home. Kicky-wicky was only a silly epithet for a wife, but it made Bertram feel he could not bear having a wife, and that he must go to the war in Italy, though the king had forbidden him. Helena he ordered to take leave of the king and return to Roussillon, giving her letters for his mother and herself. He then rode off, bidding her a cold goodbye. She opened the letter addressed to herself and read, "When you can get the ring from my finger, you can call me husband, but against that, when I write, never." Dry-eyed had Helena been when she entered the king's presence and said farewell, but he was uneasy on her account, and gave her a ring from his own finger, saying, "If you send this to me, I shall know you are in trouble and help you." She did not show him Bertram's letter to his wife. It would have made him wish to kill the truant count. But she went back to Roussillon and handed her mother-in-law the second letter. It was short and bitter. "I have run away," it said. "If the world be broad enough, I will be always far away from her. Cheer up," said the noble widow to the deserted wife. "I wash his name out of my blood, and you alone are my child." The dowager countess, however, was still mother enough to Bertram to lay the blame of his conduct on Pericles, whom she called a very tainted fellow. Helena did not stay long at Roussillon. She clad herself as a pilgrim, and leaving a letter for her mother-in-law, secretly set out for Florence. On entering that city, she inquired of a woman the way to the pilgrim's house of rest, but the woman begged the holy pilgrim to lodge with her. Helena found that her hostess was a widow who had a beautiful daughter named Diana. When Diana heard that Helena came from France, she said, "A countryman of yours, Count Roussillon, has done worthy service for Florence." But after a time Diana had something to tell which was not at all worthy of Helena's husband. Bertram was making love to Diana. He did not hide the fact that he was married, but Diana heard from Pericles that his wife was not worth caring for. The widow was anxious for Diana's sake, and Helena decided to inform her that she was the Countess Roussillon. "He keeps asking Diana for a lock of her hair," said the widow. Helena smiled mournfully, for her hair was as fine as Diana's, and of the same colour. Then an idea struck her, and she said, "Take this purse of gold for yourself. I will give Diana 3,000 crowns if she will help me to carry out this plan. Let her promise to give a lock of her hair to my husband if he will give her the ring which he wears on his finger. It is an ancestral ring. 5 counts of Roussillon have worn it, yet he will yield it up for a lock of your daughter's hair. Let your daughter insist that he shall cut the lock of hair from her in a dark room, and agree in advance that she shall not speak a single word." The widow listened attentively, with a purse of gold in her lap.
She said at last, "I consent if Diana is willing."
Diana was willing, and, strange to say, the prospect of cutting off a lock of hair from a silent girl in a dark room was so pleasing to Bertram that he handed Diana his ring and was told when to follow her into the dark room. At the time appointed, he came with a sharp knife and felt a sweet face touch his as he cut off the lock of hair, and he left the room satisfied, like a man who is filled with renown, and on his finger was a ring which the girl in the dark room had given him. The war was nearly over, but one of its concluding chapters taught Bertram that the soldier who had been impudent enough to call Helena his kicky-wicky was far less courageous than a wife. Pericles was such a boaster and so fond of trimmings to his clothes that the French officers played him a trick to discover what he was made of. He had lost his drum and had said that he would regain it unless he was killed in the attempt. His attempt was a very poor one, and he was inventing the story of a heroic failure when he was surrounded and disarmed. "Porto Tartaro Rossa," said a French lord. "What horrible lingo is this?" thought Pericles, who had been blindfolded. "He's calling for the torches," said a French man, affecting to act as interpreter. "What will you say without 'em?" "As much," replied Pericles, "as I could possibly say if you pinched me like a pasty." He was as good as his word. He told them how many there were in each regiment of the Florentine army, and he refreshed them with spicy anecdotes of the officers commanding it. Bertram was present and heard a letter read in which Pericles told Diana that he was a fool. "This is your devoted friend," said a French lord. "He's a cat to me now," said Bertram, who detested our hearthrug pets. Pericles was finally let go, but henceforth he felt like a sneak, and was not addicted to boasting. We now return to France with Helena, who had spread a report of her death, which was conveyed to the Dowager Countess at Roussillon by Lafeu, a lord who wished to marry his daughter Magdalene to Bertram. The king mourned for Helena, but he approved of the marriage, proposed for Bertram, and paid a visit to Roussillon in order to see it accomplished. "His great offence is dead," he said. "Let Bertram approach me." Then Bertram, scarred in the cheek, knelt before his sovereign and said that if he had not loved Lafeu's daughter before he married Helena, he would have prized his wife, whom he now loved when it was too late. "Love that is late offends the great sender," said the king. "Forget sweet Helena, and give a ring to Magdalene." Bertram immediately gave a ring to Lafeu, who said indignantly, "It's Helena's, it's not," said Bertram. Hereupon the king asked to look at the ring and said, "This is the ring I gave to Helena," and bade her send to me if ever she needed help. "So you had the cunning to get from her what could help her most." Bertram denied again that the ring was Helena's. But even his mother said it was. "You lie!" exclaimed the king. "Seize him, guards!" But even while they were seizing him, Bertram wondered how the ring, which he thought Diana had given him, came to be so like Helena's. A gentleman now entered, craving permission to deliver a petition to the king. It was a petition signed Diana Capilet, and it begged that the king would order Bertram to marry her, whom he had deserted after winning her love. "I'd sooner buy a son-in-law at a fair than take Bertram now," said Lafeu. "Admit the petitioner," said the king. Bertram found himself confronted by Diana and her mother. He denied that Diana had any claim on him, and spoke of her as though her life was spent in the gutter. But she asked him what sort of gentlewoman it was to whom he gave. As to her he gave the ring of his ancestors now missing from his finger. Bertram was ready to sink into the earth, but fate had one crowning generosity reserved for him. Helena entered. "Do I see reality?" asked the king. "Oh, pardon, pardon," cried Bertram, She held up his ancestral ring. "Now that I have this," said she, "will you love me, Bertram?" "To the end of my life," cried he. "My eyes smell onions," said Lafeu. Tears for Helena were twinkling in them. The king praised Diana when he was fully informed by that not very shy young lady of the meaning of her conduct. For Helena's sake she had wished to expose Bertram's meanness, not only to the king, but to himself. His pride was now in shreds, and it is believed that he made a husband of some sort after all.